Today's podcast features two separate, unique stories that are both themed around the same thing: strange events that took place in the wild. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from my YouTube channel and has been remastered for this episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Russian Death March, and it's about an event that was so horrifying, the one person who survived it couldn't speak when she finally stumbled, bloody and terrified, out of the forest. The second story you'll hear is called Bell's Canyon, and it's one of, if not the most, talked about episodes in the entire MrBallen content catalog. It's about a solo hiker who comes face to face with a very strange nighttime visitor. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please kidnap the 5-star review button and then force them to brush their teeth with a very minty toothpaste. When they're done, make them drink a huge glass of orange juice. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Russian Death March. By 1993, Lyudmila Korovina, who was a 41-year-old Russian hiking instructor, came under fairly intense criticism from her colleagues for being too survivalist with her students. They thought she was a little bit too aggressive with how she pushed her students, putting them in unnecessarily risky situations out in the wild where they weren't really ready for it, and at any point she might push them too far and wind up getting someone killed. Her students, however, absolutely adored her. They said on the mountains she was fearless and in tune with nature, and they felt very safe around her. And then at camp, she was very motherly and tender and always took the time to make sure all of her students were taken care of well before she was. Former students have said the mentorship they received from Lyudmila went well beyond just hiking instruction. They said she taught a mindset that they carried with them into adulthood, and they pointed to as one of the main reasons they were successful later in life. In the summer of 1993, Lyudmila was scheduled to lead an expedition up to the Hamar-Daban Ridge, which is in eastern Siberia, and it's one of the oldest mountains on the planet. With her on this expedition would be 6 fairly experienced hiking students that ranged in ages from 15 to 24 years old. One of those 6 students was a 23-year-old young man named Sasha, who, although he was not Lyudmila's biological son, she called him her son because she had raised him ever since he was a young child, and he looked at Lyudmila as his mother. Sasha also happened to be the most physically fit and competent of all 6 hiking students, and he would function more like an assistant to Lyudmila on this particular hike rather than a pupil. The other 5 students were 24-year-old Tatiana, 19-year-old Denis, 16-year-old Victoria, 15-year-old Timur, and 17-year-old Valentina, who she is the only reason we know anything about the horrible things that happened to this group up on Hamar-Daban Ridge. On August 1st, 1993, Lyudmila and her hiking group boarded a Trans-Siberian railway car in Kazakhstan, and later that day they arrived in a town called Marino, which is on the eastern side of Siberia on the southern end, and it butts up against the base of the Hamar-Daban mountain range. The Hamar-Daban mountain was not considered a very dangerous hike to make. It was relatively small. It was just under 2,400 meters in elevation, and in the summertime, you'd have scores of recreational hikers all over this mountain range. Plus, the weather forecast for Lyudmila and her group's multi-day hike in that mountain range was going to be incredibly favorable. It was going to be warm, clear, nice summer weather. Lyudmila had charted a course that began just outside of the town of Marino, which is the town they were staying in that first night. They were going to start next to Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in Russia. From the lake, they were going to move north and inland over this stretch that was totally barren. There was no trees, it was just rocks and grass, before ultimately reaching the Hamar-Daban Ridge, which was their destination. And at that point, there would be shelter and firewood, and they could take a break before ultimately descending. And so in total, from the lake all the way to Hamar-Daban Ridge was approximately 50 miles. Ludmila's group would not be the only group making this particular movement towards Hamardaban Ridge. They'd be taking their own path, but there'd be two other groups that were on similar courses, basically parallel to them, making their way up to the ridge. And one of those groups was actually led by Ludmila's 16-year-old biological daughter, and they had actually made plans to meet up on one of the last days of this multi-day hike. As they were making their descent, there was a forest they were going to meet up in. So Ludmila and her 6 students stayed the night in Merino, and the next morning they got up early and made their way over to Lake Baikal. The weather's beautiful, they're excited to start their journey, and they take off. And everything was going great until the late afternoon. It would turn out the weather forecasters were just completely wrong, and as soon as the group climbed above the tree line, the temperatures plummeted and it started raining and snowing on them. It was just absolutely miserable. This treacherous weather would persist over the next few days, and it really started to destroy the morale in the group. But Ludmila, she was a pro, and she had hiked in far worse conditions than this, and so she made a point of telling the group that this stuff happens. Bad weather happens. We are prepared. We are trained. We're going to be fine. You need to have a positive attitude about this. We need to just keep pushing forward and not play victim here. And that was enough to inspire the group to just keep on going. They believed in Ludmila, and she's telling them to keep going, so they kept going. By the evening of August 4th, so this is 3 full days of hiking later, they were only about 30 minutes away from the summit. They have now reached the point where they are in the open section of the mountain where there is no reprieve from the wind or the rain or the snow. There's no trees to block anything. And so it's just an absolute abomination trying to climb this last stretch. Every step is like an eternity as the wind just cuts through their clothes and they're soaking wet and miserable. Ludmila's students were not about to ask for a break. They knew how she operated. She was someone that really believed in pushing through your own pain and fatigue and misery, and she always led by example, and they saw her, right out in front leading the charge up towards the Hamardaban Ridge. And so they were very surprised when she stopped and she turned around and told them, we're taking a break, and in fact, we're actually going to camp out for the night right where we are right here. No one knows why Ludmila made this decision. On the one hand, it does make sense to take a break and say, you know what, we'll reach the summit tomorrow. We've had a really hard couple of days here with the bad weather. We'll make camp and we'll get some rest and we'll hit the summit tomorrow. That makes sense. But where she elected to make camp does not make sense. She had them stop right smack dab in the middle of this totally open section of the mountain where there are no trees, there's no objects to protect them from the horrible wind and snow and ice and rain that's just going to be pelting them all night. And so some people have speculated that when she looked at her crew of hikers, they were so badly beaten down and tired and miserable that she knew she could not ask them to go any further. And so that was why she said, let's just make camp here, we'll make do. Others have said her map may not have been very accurate. And so she didn't know how close she was to the summit, where at the summit there was literally a shelter that had firewood and a place for you to rest. Maybe she didn't know she was so close. Perhaps she thought she was much farther away and this is the best we can do. But what the inaccurate map theory does not account for is Ludmila would have known there is a forest about 2.5 miles down the mountain, because the whole time they've been on this hike, they've tried to stay up above the tree line as they make this final approach up to the ridge. And so she would have known there's a forest right down there. And if I wanted to, I could go down there and seek shelter in the trees. And so for whatever reason, she decided that we can't go down to the forest, we got to stay here. And so perhaps that lends more credibility to the idea that the group was far more beaten down than maybe we even realize. And she thought they can't make the 2.5 mile journey. We're going to have to just make camp here and make do. But regardless of her reasoning, they did make camp right in the middle of this open section. They set up 2 wet, crappy tents, and they used their little kerosene stoves to make a tiny meal. And then they all crammed inside of these 2 tents and huddled as the wind howled outside. That night, the storm got much worse. The wind picked up, and again, they're totally exposed on this open section of the mountain, and so they're just getting destroyed by this wind. And at about 2 a.m., the wind actually broke the ropes that were holding the tents down, and they had to go outside and retie them, and they were able to do that. And then a couple hours later, at about 4 a.m., the wind actually lifted up the section of the tent that was facing where the wind was blowing, and it pulled the tent up in such a way that water rushed into the tent and soaked their sleeping bags. And they were able to go outside and they put the stakes back down in the ground, but they were sleeping in wet sleeping bags in the middle of this mountain in the middle of a storm. So this is getting quite dangerous at this point. But they were able to eventually fall asleep, and at about 10 a.m. the next morning, Ludmila gets up and looks outside, and she can see that everything's frozen, that it's snowed and the temperatures have dropped again, and everything is just snow and ice. And she knows that, we're actually reaching very dangerous hypothermia territory, and if we don't warm up soon, this could be life-threatening. And so she woke everybody up and she said, we need to go down into that forest and we need to start a fire as soon as possible. And so everybody said, all right, they got up, they started packing up their things, rolled up their tents, and they began walking down the mountain in a line. Although this was not intended, when Ludmila had said we will reach the summit tomorrow, that had delayed their schedule, and it meant they were not going to be able to meet up with her daughter the next day. But now in the morning, when they're deciding basically to abandon the summit and turn around and head down again, they were now back on schedule to meet up with her daughter down in the forest. However, her daughter said she was at the rendezvous point in the forest, and Ludmila and the 6 other hikers never showed. 4 days later, on August 9th, a group of Ukrainian kayakers were making their way down this river in southern Siberia, and they were passing by the Ballen mountain range. And so as they're kind of slowly moving their way down, it's this beautiful morning, and they're looking up at the mountains all around them. The leader of this group happens to see something move on his left side. There's a forest right up against the left side of this river, and he turns his head and he has to do a double take because there is this girl who's standing there at the edge of the forest looking out at them totally expressionless, and she's covered in blood. And she's not doing anything, she's just standing there. And at first, he actually thought, we need to leave. His first thought was, we need to just get away from this person. There's something wrong with this person. But very quickly, the group realized, we cannot abandon this girl. This is a young girl who should not be out here. I don't know what she's doing out here. And so they turned around and they went on shore and they yelled to her. They said, are you okay? And she just stood there not reacting, and they tried a couple more times to say, hey, we're not going to hurt you. We just want to know what's going on. And she didn't say a word. She just stood there in shock. She looked very scared. They finally got up right next to her and they asked her, what are you so scared of? Where are you coming from? And they just could not get her to speak. But they're up close looking at her, and she's got blood all over her. She looks dirty. She looks like she might be sick. And so they decide that this girl needs help, and they had blankets, and so they threw blankets over her. They put her in one of the kayaks and they brought her back to town. Once in town, the Ukrainian kayakers went and got authorities and said, hey, we found this girl. She was covered in blood walking out of the forest. We have no idea what's going on with her. And so authorities came over to speak to her, and although she barely spoke, she would finally say that she was 17 years old, her name was Valentina Yotachenko, and that she had been a part of a 7-person hiking group up along the Ballen Ridge. And then she paused, and they said, well, where's your hiking group? How did you get separated? This is what she told them. Back on the morning of August 5th, so this would have been the morning after that terrible night's sleep on the mountain where the tent ropes are breaking and their sleeping bags are getting soaking wet. Well, Valentina wakes up and she looks outside of the tent and she sees Ludmila, and she's standing there with her hands on her hips and she's looking around. She looks very concerned. Valentina goes out there and Ludmila turns to her and says, we need to leave. We need to go down to the forest and we need to make a fire. Can you help me wake everybody up and start having them pack up their stuff so we can get moving? And so Valentina goes in, she starts waking people up, and everybody very quickly packs up the tent, packs up their things, and they're in a line and they start walking down the mountain. They had only made it about 10 meters into their descent when Sasha, the 23-year-old young man that Ludmila considered her son, he just suddenly falls. And the other hikers, Valentina included, run over and they help get him up again, and he looks kind of shaken. He takes a couple more steps and he falls again. And this time, when Valentina goes over to try to help him up with the others, they see his eyes are wide and he looks like he's really terrified, and then blood starts rushing out of his nose and his ears and his mouth, and then he just suddenly dies. And Ludmila runs over and she grabs him and she's panicking and she's trying to feel for a pulse and she's checking for his heart, and then she screams out in pain and anguish and she yells, he's dead. The other hikers can't believe this is happening. They can't even process that someone, any of them, had died, let alone it be Sasha, the most physically fit and healthy one of all of them, including up until a few minutes ago. He wasn't showing any signs or symptoms that something was wrong. He was perfectly fine. What's going on? Ludmila was in shock. She's on the ground and she's holding on to Sasha, and she's telling the group that she's not going anywhere. She's staying with Sasha. And Valentina would say the group is just falling apart at this point. You have some of them that are crying, others who are just standing there looking around like, what's happening to us right now? And at some point, Ludmila collects herself and she says to the group, go down to the forest. Go down to the forest and start a fire. And Valentina said they didn't want to leave her and they were pleading with her to let them stay. And she said, no, go down to the forest and start a fire. And finally, Valentina said the group would. They'd get together and they'd turn around, and not really knowing what was going to happen next, they just begin walking down this mountain, and they only get a few steps before they hear Ludmila yell out to come back. She's saying, "I can't move." And they turn around, and Valentina was towards the front of the returning group as they're going back up the mountain, back to Ludmila. And she's now bleeding out of her nose and her ears and her mouth. She's heaving like something's going on inside of her, and then all of a sudden she keels over on top of Sasha, and she dies right in front of them. And now the group is in hysterics, and Valentina's in the front, and she can't see anybody else. And then she turns around, and she can't believe what she's seeing to her side. Now everybody else is bleeding from their nose and their ears and their mouth, and some of them are frothing from the mouth. Valentina reached for her mouth and her ears and her nose to look for blood, and there wasn't any. And then she turned and she saw 16-year-old Victoria and 24-year-old Tatiana suddenly fall to the ground, just like Sasha had, except they weren't just laying there. They began rolling around and ripping their clothes off and clutching at their throats, and they're frothing at the mouth. And so Valentina reaches down to try to help Victoria, the 16-year-old, and Victoria bites her on the hand, and she pulls her hand back. And then Victoria curls into a ball and then goes still. And then Tatiana begins hitting her head on a rock over and over and over again until she goes still. At this point, Valentina is in pure survival mode, and so she looks at the other two, which was 15-year-old Timur and 19-year-old Dennis. Everybody else is down on the ground at this point. And she sees Dennis is moving behind a rock, and he looks like he's not acting as erratic as everybody else. And so she starts making her way over to Dennis to see if he's going to be okay. And on the way, she sees 15-year-old Timur fall to the ground, and he's suddenly lying there still. And so she believes he's dead too. She gets over to Dennis, and he's bleeding profusely from all of his orifices in his head, but he's talking to her, and he's saying, "Okay, you need to go back to your bag, get out whatever you can that is essential, ditch the rest, and run down to the forest, and I'll meet you down there." And so Valentina says okay. She makes her way up to her bag. She gets her sleeping bag and a couple other small items, and when she turns around to go back to Dennis, she sees that he's now slouched over his backpack, and now the blood is just pouring out of his head, and she can tell that almost certainly he's dead as well. And so not only is she all alone, she's now totally traumatized and believes whatever has happened to them is going to happen to her. And so she runs down the mountain and she goes into the forest and she gets underneath this rock overhang. She puts her sleeping bag down, she crawls inside, and she drifts in and out of consciousness for the rest of the day. And then that night, she's still laying there and the storm picked up dramatically, and she could hear all night these huge trees all over the mountain falling and slamming all around her. And so she's thinking, if I don't die from whatever killed my friends, I'm going to get hit by one of these trees. But she manages to get through the night. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and so Valentina gets up, and she's thinking to herself, maybe by some miracle, one of them is still alive. And so she climbs back up the mountain to where they were, and she finds all of them still laying exactly where they were when she left them, all motionless, all deceased. And so she decides to go one by one and close each of their eyelids, and then she says her goodbye, and then she turns and kind of wanders back into the forest, where she would stay for the next 4 days, desperately walking around, hoping to be rescued at some point, the whole time just expecting to die, either from exposure, from an animal attack, from whatever killed my friends. Eventually she does hear voices and she starts making her way towards where they're coming from, and that's when she gets to the river and she sees the Ukrainian kayakers who ultimately pick her up and bring her back to town. After authorities heard Valentina's story and realized there were other hikers out there, they launched a search party, and it would take them a month to locate them. Their bodies were contorted and their faces were locked in these grimaces that looked like they were in absolute terror and agony right as they died. In addition to missing most of their clothing and their shoes, they were also all missing their eyeballs. The autopsies were only able to conclude that hypothermia contributed to their death, although it wasn't the only factor, as well as a protein deficiency, despite the fact that they had all eaten well over the course of their trip, and that all of their lungs were very bruised, but they didn't know what that was from. But nothing the autopsy concluded could reconcile what Valentina said she saw happen, which was a sudden, violent death of 6 healthy people with no signs and symptoms leading up. Suddenly, they are bleeding out of every orifice and they're falling to the ground, tearing their clothes off, grabbing at their throats, frothing at the mouth, and then dying. And whatever happened to them, why didn't it happen to Valentina? To this day, we don't really have a good answer why that happened, and the case is closed. It was ruled they mostly died of hypothermia and it was an accident, and that's that. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened in Russia. In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, and about 10 days into their hike, they reached a part where they needed to crest over this mountain before some bad weather rolled in. And they started moving up this mountain, which would be renamed the Dyatlov Pass after the leader of this group. His name is Dyatlov. They started making their way up the Dyatlov Pass, and they were going too slowly, and the weather was coming in too quickly. And so they had to make a critical decision. Stay put, but be in this totally exposed, open mountain face, much like the Hamar Daban situation where they were up on that open mountain face. Either hunker down there and get ruined by weather, and the weather was a lot worse for the Dyatlov Pass group. It was, sub-zero temperatures and just snowing ruthlessly. Or they could go down and give up ground and go down to the forest at the base of this mountain where you'd be sheltered from the storm with some trees. And so these hikers who might be a little bit overconfident in their ability decide to stick it out right on this mountain face. And over the course of that night, at some point, they cut open their tent with a knife from the inside and ran out into sub-zero temperatures, most of them not wearing shoes, not wearing jackets, not wearing pants. They're basically in underwear. And they calmly walked down the mountain all the way down to the forest. And once they got down there, 2 of them tried to desperately climb this big tree where there wasn't any low-hanging branches. And so they couldn't climb up it. We don't know what they were trying to climb up it for, but they ended up building this little tiny fire that could not have provided very much warmth at all. And they were found deceased lying around this fire. 7 other hikers were found in 2 different areas. One that appeared to go down to that tree where those 2 were, but then doubled back and tried to get up to the campsite, but didn't make it and fell to the ground and died there. The other group was not found for a couple of weeks later. They were found at the mouth of this river. They were inside of this den, and they were wearing the clothes of the other hikers that were deceased. And the clothes they had on had traces of radiation on them. And the ones that were in the den had these devastating chest and skull injuries, and one of them was missing their eyeballs. And the official statement by the Soviet Union was they died from an unknown compelling force, which is a really mysterious way to describe how someone might die. This case was actually reinvestigated in 2020, and the new cause of death is death by avalanche, except loads of people disagree with that. In fact, experts have gone out to where this happened, and they say not only was there no avalanche, there's never been an avalanche in this area. There's literally never been one. So what do you think? Is there a connection between Hamar Daban and the Dyatlov Pass incident? Is there a cover-up in both cases where something far more sinister has happened to both groups that we don't know about? Or are they unrelated and these are just both examples of Mother Nature being far more powerful than we even realize? The next and final story of today's episode is a MrBallen fan favorite. It's called Bell's Canyon. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman, and so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down, and periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do, so he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent. And this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him, and the guy's eyes go wide, and he stands up, turns around, and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this, and so he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside, and shines his light into the forest looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington state. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm going to look out and I'm going to see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm going to see his campsite. Maybe he's set up nearby and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees, any light source anywhere out there he would see. And there's not one. There's no fire, there's no flashlight, there is nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent, he zips it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here and, stranger things have happened, so that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. And he's pretty sure it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time he can't really just write it off. Clearly there is something behind him that's moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. Because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone, and clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, "I don't know where Bell's Canyon is." And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him is thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question, a bit more forcefully this time.
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
his voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's gonna fall, get hurt, he's gonna get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away, and so Matt just goes back to his campsite, and he's thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was going to be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours, he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 in the morning, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again, he didn't see him again, and he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's going to pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. When the sun came up, Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched, he was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent. And he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point, when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so once his tent was set up, he just climbed inside, grabbed his knife, and sat there, knowing this guy was somewhere out there. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there, expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone, finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then, as he's laying there from somewhere out in the woods,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Matt immediately sat up, his heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do, he didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds, and he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd kick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time, he leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot, he got to a nearby hotel, he finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy, but he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime, he was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear. And all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please kidnap the 5-star review button and then force them to brush their teeth with a very minty toothpaste. When they're done, make them drink a huge glass of orange juice. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all platforms is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. There are some places in the world that we are just not meant to go. And today's 3 stories will remind us that we really should just stay away from those places. The audio from all three of today's stories have been pulled from our main YouTube channel and have been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Not So Lazy River, and it's about two people who decide to take rafts on a very unique body of water. The second story you'll hear is called Out on a Limb, and it's about a farmer who decides to stay out late to finish his harvest, but little did he know, this decision would cost him dearly. And the third and final story you'll hear is called The Popelick Monster, and it's about a couple who literally go looking for a folklore monster somewhere in Kentucky, but in doing so, they actually come face to face with a real monster. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to do the Amazon Music follow button's dishes, but be sure to leave all the cups and bowls upright in the dishwasher. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Not So Lazy River. If you take a trip to Hawaii, there's a good chance you'll visit the beautiful Rainbow Falls on the eastern side of the Big Island. But if you travel less than a mile upstream of those falls, you'll find an equally beautiful attraction that far less people know about, and it's called the Boiling Pots. 10,000 years ago, after a volcanic eruption, lava was flowing down the side of the mountain when it entered the Wailuku River. As the lava gradually cooled, the river water flowing all around it wound up carving out these standalone pools of water that were connected by a series of small waterfalls. These pools collectively make up the boiling pots, and they get their name because periodically the water in these pools appears to be boiling. Tourists at the boiling pots are allowed to look at the water from a safe distance on the cement overlook, but under no circumstances are allowed to actually enter the water. In 2015, Jolie Ricewig was a 62-year-old woman living in Kona, Hawaii, which is on the western side of the island. There, she owned a bed and breakfast, whose main allure was that guests at this bed and breakfast got to go on these fun adventure tours with Jolie all over the island. And they almost always involved paddleboarding or swimming, because Jolie was an avid outdoors person and a very talented swimmer and swim instructor, and so felt comfortable leading these types of excursions. On September 14th of that year, Jolie brought one of her male guests from her bed and breakfast out for an adventure tour at the Boiling Pots. She would have known that it was an off-limits area for swimmers because there were signs up everywhere saying as much, but Jolie wasn't planning to swim in the Boiling Pots. Instead, she was planning to float on them on inflatable rafts. And so she and this man climbed aboard their respective rafts and began paddling around one of the upper pools, taking in the incredible view of this natural phenomenon. As they were relaxing, suddenly there was this rush of water that came tumbling over the fall that dumped down into the pool they were in. It was a flash flood, and before Jolie and this man could swim outside of the pool and get to safety, the water under them began to churn violently and actually thrust them over the edge down into the next pool. And as soon as they hit the water, they had fallen off of their rafts. Now they're swimming in the water, and they're feeling a current pulling them down and pulling them forward towards the next lip into the next pool. And so they both began desperately swimming towards the edge. Jolie actually grabbed the man and helped push him up and out to safety. And as soon as he was on land, he turned around to grab her, but she wasn't there. And so he's looking around and all he can see is her raft floating on the surface being taken down into the rapids. And so he thinks, okay, she must have fallen into the next pool. And so on the side of the waterway, he runs down and he's looking into the next pool, the next pool, the next pool, and she's nowhere to be found. And after a few minutes of looking and not knowing where she was, he called the authorities. They came out and they launched this huge search for her, but despite searching the entirety of the Boiling Pots and all the way downstream, there was no sign of her. And after looking for an entire week, they never found anything. It was like she just disappeared, and so they turned the search off. As devastating as this was for the family to not have closure about what happened to Jolie, this was not a surprising outcome. In fact, it was almost an expected outcome considering why the Boiling Pots are off limits to swimmers. Each of the pools of water that make up the boiling pots is a deep, nearly vertical shaft of water, and at the bottom of it are these entrances to these underground tunnels. And these entrances are big enough for a person to slip inside of. And these tunnels are not short. They go on for a long ways in all different directions. In a flash flood scenario, that increased water that's flowing down the boiling pots creates this unbelievable current that inside of each of these pools is pulling straight down, which gives the water the impression that it's boiling, because basically the water's tumbling over as it's being filtered up and down inside of this vertical shaft. And so if you get grabbed by this current, it's going to pull you down and into one of these tunnels, and you won't get out again unless the current releases you. And so Jolie, after helping her guest get out of the water to safety, she was pulled down and into one of these tunnels, and she was held there for 5 months until finally the current released her and her remains were spotted just below the pots in a tide pool. Our next story is called Out on a Limb. On the evening of March 25th, 2017, a 25-year-old farmer named Akbar Solobiro was harvesting palm fruit at the local oil palm grove near his tiny village in Indonesia. Now, the way Akbar would do this is he would use this long curved pole and he would prod at the bright red fruit in the tree, knocking it to the ground, and then he would gather it up, put it in his cart, and wheel it back home to be sold for palm oil. Now, on this night, Akbar was actually working later than usual because his wife and kids were out of town for a couple of days visiting family, and so there was no real reason to head back home because the house was empty. But Akbar was actually just fine with that because there was tons of ripe fruit, and so staying late would be quite profitable. But after a while, when the sun had finally set and it was getting difficult to actually even see the fruit in the tree, Akbar knew he really needed to leave soon because this area at night was actually not safe. And so Akbar gathered up the remainder of his fruit on the ground, he put his pole in the cart as well, and he began quickly making his way back home. Later that evening, one of Akbar's neighbors was asleep in their bed inside of their home when they woke up suddenly to the sound of something out in the jungle, not far from where Akbar had been harvesting palm fruit. And so this neighbor, when they sat up, they couldn't really tell what the sound was. It almost sounded like a stifled scream or maybe some animal that was fighting with another animal. But as the neighbors sat there straining their ears to try to hear it again, they didn't. All they heard was normal sounds coming from the outside. And so the neighbor decided that the sound they heard must have been a cat or maybe a monkey. And, whatever it was, it couldn't have been a big deal. And so this neighbor went back to sleep. The following evening, so 24 hours later, another one of Akbar's neighbors walked outside of their home to begin the walk over to the jungle to harvest palm fruit. And when they went outside, normally around this time, Akbar would be coming outside as well, because these two often went to the grove together. But, this neighbor is looking and Akbar's not outside, and he looks up at Akbar's house and it's dark and quiet. And so this neighbor's thinking to themselves, where is Akbar? I know he worked late last night. I didn't hear him come in. And come to think of it, I haven't seen him all day. And now, of course, I'm not seeing him as well. And so this neighbor, feeling concerned about Akbar, walked over and knocked on his door, but nobody answered. And so really starting to think that something could be wrong with Akbar, this neighbor went to Akbar's uncle's house. And when Akbar's uncle came to the door, this neighbor explained what was going on and they're concerned that, something could have happened to Akbar. And so the uncle and this neighbor would go back over to Akbar's home and they would actually try the door. It was locked. They looked inside the windows and it looked like no one was in there. And they also noticed that where Akbar typically kept his cart that he would transport his fruit in, it wasn't there either, which made them think, Akbar must still be out somewhere with this cart because this cart is very important to him. And so ultimately, the uncle, after seeing the state of his nephew's home, he agreed with this neighbor that, something was wrong here. And if they wanted to find Akbar, they really needed to get together a search party right now and go looking for him. So the uncle contacted the leaders of the village, and they, in turn, rounded up all the able-bodied men in the village, and they all got together with headlamps and flashlights and machetes and knives, and then all together, they began walking away from the village into the jungle in the direction of this palm grove, which was the place that Akbar had been last. And so this big group of men, they get inside the jungle and they begin walking along this path, which was the most likely path that Akbar would have taken to go to the palm grove and also to return from the palm grove. And as they're walking, the sun is starting to set, it's getting dark, and the animals in the jungle, they're all making noises and kind of yelling at this group as they're moving through. And this group, they're shining their light around looking for any sign of Akbar, but there wasn't any. They were calling his name out, there was no response. And then at some point, as they got closer to the palm grove, they noticed there were a couple of bright red fruits, palm fruits, that had clearly been recently harvested that were scattered on the trail. And so the group began to fan out in this area, thinking that, oh my goodness, Akbar must be somewhere nearby. Maybe there was some sort of accident and he's fallen somewhere, or just something's happened to him, but he's got to be in this area. And so the group began fanning out off the trail, kind of hacking their way through all the underbrush. And then suddenly, one of the men, after he hacked through a particularly dense stretch of the jungle, he looked down and saw something and began to scream, and he raised his machete and began running forward. As far as we can tell, this is what happened to Akbar. The previous night, after Akbar had decided, it wasn't safe to be in the jungle at night, he needed to leave, and so he gathered up all of his things and he began walking along that path where the search party would find all that fruit scattered on the trail. And so he's walking along this path, and he thinks he's alone, he thinks he's okay, but in reality, he wasn't. He was being watched and followed very closely from something up in the trees. And so as Akbar moved along, this thing was kind of trailing him and seeing what he was going to do. And then at some point, this thing up in the trees began moving its way down closer and closer to Akbar. It was a 23-foot long reticulated python. It was a massive snake. And this snake came down and launched an attack on Akbar, grabbing the back of his neck with its powerful jaws. And as soon as the snake clamped down on Akbar's neck, he let out a stifled scream, which was the scream that had woken up that other neighbor who sat up in bed wondering what that was. That was Akbar screaming out. But that was the only sound Akbar could make, because immediately the snake wrapped itself all around Akbar and squeezed him tight. And after crushing Akbar, breaking almost every bone in his body, the snake relaxed and then slithered off of Akbar. And so Akbar fell to the ground and was either dead or very close to death. And at this point, the snake opened up its jaws and positioned itself right in front of Akbar's head. And then it began kind of slithering itself forward, consuming Akbar head first. And the way pythons do this is they don't really chew on their victim. Instead, they kind of put their mouth over the top of whatever they're going to consume, and they kind of undulate and walk their bodies forward, driving the victim deeper and deeper into their body until they are completely consumed. And so the next night, when one of the members of the search party had gone off the trail and began hacking away and then saw something and charged after it with his machete, what he was seeing was the python, who very clearly had a person inside of its stomach. You could see the outline of the person. And so this search party member ran forward and hacked the snake, opened it up, and there was Akbar fully dressed and deceased inside of the snake. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Popelick Monster. While she was in high school in Dayton, Ohio, Raquel Bain became known as a bit of a thrill seeker, primarily because she would do something called car surfing, which is exactly what it sounds like. She would climb onto the exterior of cars and hold on to the roof while somebody else drove it around. In addition to seeking out these physical thrills, Raquel was also drawn to psychological ones, like going to places that were supposedly haunted and seeing if she could spook herself. Following high school, Raquel kind of calmed down and became less of the wild teenager she was known for being, and instead she really focused on building a life and a career for herself. And so she would go to college and she would earn her degree in surgical technologies. And then by 2009, she was employed full-time as a surgical assistant in Dayton. Also around that time, she had her first child, a son who she adored. But despite creating this life full of stereotypically adult, mature things like having a career and starting a family, deep down, Raquel was still very much the thrill-seeking wild teenager she was back in high school. But as an adult, she just never had time to go seek out those thrills. So, with that in mind, fast forward to April of 2016. By this point, Raquel is 26 years old, and that month, a very rare weekend popped up where Raquel did not have to work, and she didn't have any childcare responsibilities. And so, wanting to take advantage of this free time, Raquel asked her boyfriend, 41-year-old David Nee, if he would join her on a road trip that weekend to Louisville, Kentucky, where Raquel wanted to check out the infamously scary Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Back in the 1900s, Waverly Hills was a place where tuberculosis patients were sent. Tuberculosis, or TB for short, is an infection of the lungs, and it can be deadly. Today, there's a cure for it, but back in the early 1900s, there wasn't. And so most of the people who went to Waverly Hills died there, and usually very slowly and painfully, and in total isolation from their families, because in virtue of being sent to Waverly Hills, they were effectively being quarantined to stop the spread of the disease. Waverly Hills would eventually shut down permanently in 1961, because by that point the cure had been found, and after it shut down, the building basically just sat there. Nobody else came in and turned it into anything else. And so this building is basically abandoned, and lots of people began sneaking in to see what it was like in there, and a shocking number of these trespassers reported seeing ghosts inside. Today, the sanatorium is still very much in the same condition it was left in, but the Waverly Hills Historical Society has stepped in and made it very hard for people to sneak into the building. However, knowing people do want to go in and look around, the Historical Society has begun offering guided tours of the sanatorium, and these tours are given exclusively at night to increase the spooky effect. And so David, who had only been dating Raquel for a month when she asked him to come with her to the sanatorium, he was not really that keen on doing this. It did not really appeal to him to go walking around this totally terrifying place. But he could tell it was important to Raquel, she was really excited about it, and so he agreed to go. A few days later, on the late afternoon of April 23rd, the new couple left Raquel's place, they climbed into the car, and they began driving south. 3 hours later, they arrived in Louisville, and they stopped to get dinner, and then after they were done eating, they looked at the time and realized it was only about 6:45 p.m., and the tour they had scheduled at the sanatorium was not until 10 p.m., so they had a few hours to kill. And before David could suggest anything, Raquel already had the perfect idea of how they should kill this time. She told David that earlier that day she had learned about a spot just outside of Louisville that might actually be more terrifying than the sanatorium they had come all this way to see. And so Raquel wanted to spend these few hours checking out this new spooky spot. This spooky spot was a rickety old, narrow, abandoned-looking bridge called the Pope Lick Trestle. It's located just east of downtown Louisville in this heavily wooded area. The bridge is about 800 feet long, and at its highest point, right in the middle of the bridge, it's about 90 to 100 feet off the ground. And this bridge connects the tops of two of the bigger rolling hills in the area. But the bridge's physical appearance has nothing to do with why it's considered so spooky. The reason the Pope Lick Trestle has become a central part of Kentucky folklore is because locals say there is a monster called the Pope Lick Monster that lives underneath the bridge. It's half goat, half man, and when anyone is near this bridge at night, this monster is supposed to come out from underneath this bridge, and then what happens next is very ambiguous. It kind of depends on who you're talking to, but generally speaking, once the Pope Lick Monster has emerged and it sees you, you're dead. Now, how you die ranges from the monster leaping out and attacking you with an axe, to the monster using some sort of mind control to lure you up onto the bridge where you leap off. David, after hearing this suggestion, was again not really that keen to go do this really terrifying sounding thing, but seeing the excitement in his girlfriend's face, he agreed to go. And so the two left the restaurant, they climbed back in the car, and they drove for about 15 or 20 minutes to the Pope Trestle Bridge. The bridge actually passed over a relatively main road, and so the couple parked just off the side of this main road. And then once they were outside, they began looking for a pathway up this hillside to get up to the bridge. And very quickly, they found a well-worn dirt path that snaked up the side of this wooded hillside that looked very much like it would bring them up to the bridge. So with Raquel in front and David behind her, they began walking up this dirt path. And as they're walking, they start to see signs that clearly say, "No trespassing." But they ignore them because they're looking at this path thinking, okay, lots of people clearly come up here, so we've got to be okay. And so they keep on walking up this path, and they're getting closer and closer to the top of this hill where they think it's going to connect with this bridge. And right as they're getting close, they see there's this huge chain link fence, this 8-foot tall chain link fence with barbed wire across the top that extends in either direction out of view. And so the couple walks up to this fence, and there are more signs that say no trespassing, private property, and there are additional warning signs saying that what is on the other side of this fence is also just plain dangerous, so turn around and leave. But as Raquel and David are staring at all these signs and this fence, they see, not far from the path, somebody had clearly bent two of the fence posts and created a narrow gap in the fence that you could slip through. And so from David and Raquel's perspective, that looked like the way other trespassers must have found their way up to the bridge, and so it must be safe. And so once again, the couple disregarded all the warnings. They made their way over to this gap in the fence, they both slipped through, and they kept on walking up the hill. Just a couple of minutes later, they reached this clearing, which was at the top of this hill, and once they were in this clearing, they were able to turn, and they could actually see the bridge. It was only a couple hundred feet away from them, and it was totally intimidating. By this point, it's totally dark out, and from their perspective, all they see is this very narrow bridge that they know is 100 feet off the ground at certain points, and they can see there's no guardrails on either side of this bridge. It would have almost looked like a tightrope kind of extending off into the darkness. But even if the couple was really intimidated by the sight of this bridge and with all these warning signs before it, they were able to put their fear aside and just keep on going. And so with David now in the lead and Raquel behind him, they walked the couple of hundred feet over to the start of this narrow bridge, and when they got there, without actually stepping onto the bridge, David came to a stop, he turned around to face Raquel, and he gestured for her to come stand next to him so they could take a selfie with the bridge in the background. Because David at this point is thinking, we're not going to go on this bridge, we're just going to look at this bridge, take some pictures, and then we'll go. But Raquel, who he's looking at, gesturing to come stand with him, just walks right past him onto the bridge and takes several steps out onto this narrow, rickety old thing, and then she stops, turns around, and gestures for David to come with her and walk across the entire bridge. And David, again, is having his second thoughts, but he sees Raquel wants to do this, and so he agrees to go. After they had walked about 100, maybe 200 feet across this bridge, the two of them just started laughing because it was totally exhilarating what they were doing. Not so much the quest for the Pope monster, but rather the very real risk they were taking walking this tightrope bridge in the middle of the night. The couple would continue to very cautiously but quickly make their way across this bridge, and when they reached about the halfway point, when they were at the highest point from the ground, the bridge itself begins to shake. And then from behind them, they hear this loud grinding sound. And so the couple, they whip their heads around and they see there are these two bright glowing lights that are looking right at them all the way on the start of the bridge. And they realize it's a train. When Raquel and David walked up that dirt path and snuck through the fence and reached the top of the hill and could actually see the Pope Trestle Bridge, they would have also seen the train tracks in the hillside that clearly extended onto the Pope Trestle and went across the bridge. This was a train bridge. They would have seen that. But it's assumed that the couple, who didn't live in the area and so didn't know much about the Poplik trestle, it's assumed they thought, well, this is a train bridge, but it's got to be abandoned. It certainly looks abandoned, and it does. It looks totally old. It does not look active, even though it is. Or the couple thought, well, this is just an old train bridge. It might be active, but surely no train is going to come through anytime soon. We can get across the bridge before a train arrives. But, of course, they were wrong. When the couple turned around and saw these two headlights bearing down on them, they quickly realized they would not be able to outrun this train. The train's clearly trying to stop. It has seen them. It's hitting its brakes. It's sounding its horn, but it's just clearly moving too quickly. So they cannot run to the other side to safety. And because this bridge was meant for a single train to pass through, there was no other track they could just jump onto to avoid being hit. And there were no walkways on either side of this railway. And so literally all they had was the track that this train was going to cross over, and they were on it. And so with no other choices, David yells to Raquel that they have to climb down and hang off the side of this bridge. Now, there were these wooden slats that ran underneath the rails. They ran perpendicular to the rails, and these wooden slats kind of extended off the edge of the bridge on either side just a couple of inches. And so in theory, if you were holding onto the outside of one of these wooden slats and kind of dangling off the edge of the bridge, a train could cross those tracks and not run over your hands or fingers. You would just have to hold on that whole time as the train is rumbling through. And so David, he flops down onto his stomach, and he's trying to lower himself as fast as he can as this train is getting closer and closer, and he's yelling for Raquel to do the same thing, but she's not really moving very quickly. And finally, David, he gets in position. He's hanging off the edge of this bridge on these wooden slats, and he sees Raquel. She's not quite there, and then the train comes flying through. It strikes Raquel and sends her flying off the bridge to the ground below. David would somehow manage to hold on the whole time as this train went past him. And then once the train had passed him, he pulled himself back up onto the tracks. He ran the rest of the way across the bridge. He went down that hillside. And when he found Raquel, it was immediately apparent that she was deceased. In the end, the railroad was not issued any citations or sued for negligence. It was determined they did their due diligence by setting up that 8-foot-tall barbed wire fence with all those signs telling people to stay back and warning people about the hazards of going past this fence. It was actually David who got in trouble for this tragedy. He was cited and charged with a felony of unlawfully disrupting and or delaying a train causing financial damages. He would plead to a lesser charge of trespassing and would be fined $2,300. Shockingly, this tragedy is just one of many that have occurred on the Poplik Trestle Bridge. Since the bridge's construction in the 1800s, there have been dozens of people who have died on this bridge. And several of these deaths, many of them fairly recent, the last 20 or so years, have occurred under the same conditions as Raquel's. People went looking for the Poplik monster and then were struck by a train. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In 1992, in a small town in Michigan, a woman decided to go for a walk in the woods with her 5 dogs. So she and her animals left the house she was staying in and marched across the backyard into the nearby forest, and they began walking. A few hours later, one of those 5 dogs suddenly came bounding out of the forest back towards the house all by itself. When the woman's family noticed the animal, they knew something was wrong, so they rushed into the woods to see what was going on. What they would find out there was horrific, and it would become one of the most sensational crime stories to ever come out of Michigan's remote and mysterious Upper Peninsula. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to house sit for the Amazon Music follow button, but when you get there, just prop all of their doors and windows open and then leave. Okay, let's get into today's story. "35-year-old Judy Moylanen checked one more time that her 3-year-old daughter was safely buckled into her car seat, and then, with a sigh of relief, Judy climbed into the passenger seat of the van and nodded to her husband Bruce, who was at the wheel, letting him know that they were now ready to go. The car engine was already on, and the inside of the vehicle was nice and warm, and in another minute, they had backed down the driveway of their neat brick ranch house directly onto US Route 41. It was Thanksgiving Day, November 26th, 1992, and even now, hours before they would sit down to the traditional turkey dinner and prayer of gratitude, Judy was already feeling a little unaccustomed rush of happiness as she and Bruce headed west along 41 towards Judy's parents' house, where they would spend the holiday weekend. Just 2 days ago, Judy had wondered if this trip would even be possible. Here, in Michigan's remote Upper Peninsula, Thanksgiving is almost overshadowed by the state's 2-week-long deer hunting season that spans the last 2 weeks of November. It's a time when the biggest fashion trend is blaze orange, and even visitors to the little town of Harvey, where the Moylanens lived, were more likely to ask each other, "Did you get your buck yet?" than they were to just wave and say hello. And on the first day of hunting season, Bruce had managed to bring home a male deer with a good-sized rack of antlers. But on the drive back to their house after he was finished hunting, Bruce had hit another deer that was crossing the road, and that collision had totaled the Moylanens' Subaru station wagon. And it wasn't until the day just before Thanksgiving that the couple had been able to find and place a down payment on a replacement vehicle large enough to carry all of their luggage, as well as their 4 dogs. Unlike Judy's job as an assistant hospital administrator at nearby Marquette General Hospital, Bruce's side gig as a dog trainer meant that the family required a car that could accommodate several dog crates as well as 3 passengers. And the tan Chevrolet van was definitely comfortable as well as roomy. Within just a few minutes of starting their 2.5-hour drive, Elise had already dropped off to sleep. And with Bruce focused on how their new vehicle handled, Judy had a rare opportunity to just sit there and let her mind wander. Day to day, Judy's work was very demanding and she put in long hours. Even coupled with his dog training business and freelance work as an insurance claim adjuster, Bruce's main job as an instrument technician for Marquette General Hospital did not bring in as much money as Judy's regular paycheck. Not that Judy looked or acted the part of the traditional family breadwinner. Compared to her husband, who was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and 180 pounds, Judy was just 5 foot 4 inches tall, with short, curly, light brown hair, and a quiet but practical manner. But behind Judy's oversized glasses, her eyes sparkled when she smiled. And she smiled a lot, just as she was quick to laugh at other people's jokes. And although Judy never sought out the social spotlight, in fact, that kind of attention would have just made her feel uncomfortable, her ability to listen and respond in ways that made others around her shine meant that people just really loved Judy and liked being around her. And there had always been more to Judy than met the eye. She adored her parents and her 2 brothers, and she was looking forward to spending the upcoming weekend chatting comfortably inside the snug family home with her mom and sister-in-law while Elise played with her cousins. But, like her younger brothers, Judy was also an outdoors person. Ever since she could walk, the woods in the back of her parents' home had been Judy's playground. And growing up in Ontonagon, with a population of just 2,000 people and a business district that did not have one single stoplight, there had been plenty of woods as well as fields and streams to explore. And so during that time, Judy had become very comfortable outdoors. She had also become skilled at handling firearms. So, in addition to enjoying plenty of time in the kitchen and in front of the fireplace, Judy was also looking forward to getting out in the forest with Bruce and her dad and brothers to do some hunting of their own. Hunting wasn't the only outdoor sport that Judy was really good at. She was also an excellent skier. In fact, it was that passion that had brought her and Bruce together back in 1974 when Judy was 17 and Bruce, who lived in a town even smaller than Ontonagon, was 20. But good as Judy was on skis, Bruce was even better. And at Porcupine Mountain, located right on the edge of Lake Superior, Bruce's ability and job with the ski patrol conferred a lot of status on a young man whose mother had barely scraped up the money to put food on the table for their 4 children, and whose father spent a lot of time at the local bars. So, at first glance, Judy and Bruce had been an unlikely couple. Overcoming his difficult childhood, Bruce had grown into a cocky and outgoing young man who never hesitated to speak his mind. Judy, on the other hand, came from a deeply religious, deeply conservative family whose morals and religious beliefs she shared. Her parents, Dale and Marianne Blake, had been high school sweethearts whose first child, Judy, had been born when Marianne was 21. Together, and for the last 40 years, the Blakes had owned and operated their own small automobile and oil business called Dale's Service. And as the Blake family grew with the arrival of Judy's 2 brothers, Marianne had supplemented their income with her job at First National Bank in Ontonagon, and then with the job she held now at Lake Superior Credit Union. But when it came to Judy's social life, even without her parents' tendency to be overprotective of their only daughter, Judy herself preferred reading and arts and crafts to parties and dating. Just as she would have chosen a good piece of pie and a cold glass of milk over a bottle of beer and a bowl of peanuts. But when Judy and Bruce both wound up attending Northern Michigan University in Marquette at the same time, the attraction between them was irresistible. And on June 24, 1978, 4 years after meeting on the slopes of Porcupine Mountain, Bruce and Judy were married. Afterward, the couple stayed in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, but they moved 120 miles east to Harvey. Once there, Judy established her career at the nearby Marquette General Hospital. Bruce, who started out in healthcare as an emergency medical technician, eventually took the instrument technician job at Marquette General Hospital. Along the way, Bruce had established North County Claim Service, a small independent insurance business, and Big Creek Kennels. And 11 years after exchanging their wedding vows, the couple had added to the ranks of the Blake and Moylanen families with the birth of their first and so far only child, Elise, now napping soundly in the back seat of the 1987 Chevrolet van. Just the thought of her daughter always made Judy smile. And ever since Judy had suffered a serious concussion in a freak accident the year before, she had been reminded all over again about the importance of family and friends. She knew how happy her own parents would be to have their adult children, plus all 6 grandchildren, together under one roof for this holiday weekend. Not to mention the added excitement of 4 extra dogs, all Springer Spaniels just like her parents' dog, Streak. But even as Judy looked forward to the Blake family reunion and good food that now lay just 2 hours ahead of them in a hometown that she had always loved, she could not entirely ignore that sense of dread that had become so familiar to her. And it was just not a feeling that she had been able to share with her family or with Bruce. He was handy around the house, great about taking care of Elise when Judy's workdays stretched to 12 hours, and he was also a better cook than she was. But discussing and exploring their innermost thoughts was not one of his strengths. Looking over at her husband now, his big familiar hands firmly on the wheel, Judy reminded herself that this was not the time to worry. This was the time for her and Bruce to relax, take stock of their lives and blessings, and spend time together over the long weekend. And sure enough, after Thursday's wonderful Thanksgiving celebration, Judy and Bruce were able to put in 2 full days of hunting together, while Elise enjoyed the attention of her grandmother and Marianne's own mother, Elise's great-grandmother Nimi. So on Friday, while Judy's brothers headed for their deer camp about 16 miles south, Bruce and Judy decided to try their luck at a hunting spot even further away. But at Dishnaw Creek, their attempts to drive deer out of cover were unsuccessful, and so were the hours they spent sitting quietly in small camouflage shacks called blinds. So, by late afternoon, Judy was ready to call it a day. The falling darkness and the sound of howling coyotes suddenly made her wish she was back at home instead of growing stiff with cold in these unfamiliar woods. But even as she stepped out of her blind to call out to Bruce, from behind her there was the sound of a gunshot. Down a small hill and across the creek in front of her, Bruce was so alarmed by the sudden noise he practically leapt out of his blind, hoping it was Judy who had fired at a deer. Instead, he saw his wife approaching through the dark, just carrying her flashlight, not her rifle. The shot had been so close to where Judy was standing that the whole episode shook both of them. It was a reminder of just how dangerous hunters could be, not just to the wildlife, but to other hunters. After that, Judy and Bruce abandoned their blinds and headed back to their van. The next morning, which was Saturday, the couple felt much better, and so Bruce and Judy did not need any persuading to go hunting again. But this time, they decided to go with other family members rather than striking out on their own again. Especially with hunting season about to close, everyone knew there were bound to be some hunters out in the woods who were going to be shooting at anything just to get that last buck. And by the time Judy woke up on Sunday morning, her only regret of the weekend was that her 4-day holiday was just hours from being over. She and Bruce had both come back empty-handed from hunting the day before, but better that, Judy thought, than just wounding a deer. That's what had happened to her cousin Mike, who had asked Bruce to get up early that morning and go back into the woods to see if they could find this wounded deer and put it out of its misery. As for Judy, while Bruce was out hunting, dropping in on some friends, and running errands before their return trip that evening back to Harvey, Judy was content to stay home with her sisters-in-law, her mom, and Grandma Nemi. After her mother had served up their traditional post-Thanksgiving lunch of turkey casserole, Judy was also glad to have the chance to give her mom a break. So, after everyone had finished eating, Judy urged her mother to take some time alone in her little office to relax and catch up on some bookkeeping for work, while Judy cleaned up and did the dishes. By about 1:15 p.m., Judy had the kitchen and dining room all squared away. Hanging the dish towel on its usual hook, Judy glanced at her watch and decided that now was a good time for her to take the 5 dogs out for their afternoon walk. Her younger brother, Jerry, and his family, who lived 4 hours away in Wisconsin, were planning to leave on Tanagan by 2:30, so Judy had just about an hour before she needed to be back with the dogs. As Judy pulled on her black down jacket, her parents' dog, Streak, was practically dancing with excitement at the signs that he was about to go outside. But it was the 4 much more obedient Moylanen dogs, kenneled outside, who really needed the exercise. They were the ones with a long night of travel ahead. Judy didn't bother with a leash. This was 1992 and the Upper Peninsula, and dogs were free to run around. A few minutes later, Judy called out a goodbye to her mom and opened the door to step out into the thick woods just beyond the edge of her parents' backyard. As she did, she pulled her coat tighter around herself. Not only was it already below freezing outside, but the air was so damp it felt even colder, and the afternoon clouds completely blocked the sun. An hour later, at 2:15 p.m., Jerry and his wife had their car all packed and ready to go. The only thing they had left to do was to wait for Judy so they could say their final goodbyes before heading home. And that is when the Blakes looked out the back window of the kitchen and saw Streak come running out of the woods, tongue lolling and tail wagging. Except that Streak was all alone. Judy and the other 4 dogs were nowhere to be seen. By 4 p.m., Judy's mother knew there was something wrong. For the past hour and a half, Marianne had been telling herself that Streak, who was not nearly as well trained as Judy and Bruce's dogs, must have just decided it was time to go home. And Judy was probably still out in the woods thinking Streak was out there too, lost or just wandering around. But by 4:20, Marianne knew she was clutching at straws. There was just no way that Judy would stay out this long walking the dogs or looking for Streak, and no way she would have missed saying goodbye to Jerry and his family. So, with Bruce and Marianne's husband and her other son and his family all out of the house, Marianne decided to leave little Elise with her great-grandma Nemi and go find Judy herself. And minutes later, Marianne was at the door putting on her coat and boots, but Marianne's first attempt to find her daughter failed. In fact, when Marianne had blown the dog whistle she brought with her, the sight of the 4 dogs running in her direction and still no sign of Judy had only served to turn Marianne's sense of worry into outright fear. And by the time she had managed to get the dogs back in their kennels and return to the woods, Marianne was on the verge of tears. So she didn't hesitate when her neighbor, Bill Dorvanen, who had seen the older woman picking her way into the woods, offered to help with the search. And grabbing his flashlight, Bill now led the 2 of them deeper into the woods. It was about 5 p.m., and the sun was just 10 minutes away from setting when Bill saw Judy's body. Marianne's only daughter was right in front of them, lying across the trail on her left side, her eyes open and blank in the glare of the flashlight. Judy's head was resting on a slight rise, and her feet were partly submerged in a pool of icy water. When Bill carefully turned Judy over onto her back, her arms fell to either side, and a moment later, both Bill and behind him, Marianne, could see that Judy's upper right chest was completely soaked in dark red blood. It didn't take long for the local sheriff's deputy and emergency medical technicians who had responded to Bill's 911 call to confirm what Bill and a hysterical Marianne already knew, that Judy was dead. In fact, by the time those first responders had reached the scene at about 5:20 p.m., Judy's body was already showing signs of rigor mortis, a stiffening of her limbs that suggested Judy may have already been dead for as long as 3.5 hours. Before the medics removed Judy's body, Sheriff's Deputy Tom Cusino had done the best he could to gather any evidence of what might have happened to Judy. Even though it looked like a tragic hunting accident, law enforcement would still need to find out exactly what happened and who may have fired the stray bullet that had killed Judy. But even though the deputy had made sure to take plenty of pictures of Judy's body and the surrounding area, all he could really see were scattered leaves and dog prints. And he already knew from talking to the Blake's neighbor that one critical piece of evidence, the original position of the victim's body, had already been compromised when Bill had shifted Judy's body to check for signs of life. Now, after taking Marianne to stay with another neighbor, Bill had rejoined the deputy and told him everything that Marianne had said about why she was out in the woods looking for her daughter in the first place, how Judy's walk with the dogs had lasted far too long, and how Streak had come without Judy. In answer to the deputy's questions, Bill said no, this was not an area where people generally went hunting. It was too populated and too close to the 8 or 9 families, like the Blakes and Dorvanens, that lived right behind the woods on Cherry Lane. Then, together with one of the ambulance drivers, all 3 men used flashlights to search for any sign of the bullet or bullets that had nearly ripped Judy's body in half. It seemed likely that the shot had come from a rifle, a type of gun that ejects its spent shell casings after firing, but after tramping around in the woods in the dark, the search did not turn up either a casing or a bullet. And so, after marking the area for further investigation, by 6 p.m., Deputy Casino was ready to give the order for Judy's body to be removed from the scene, placed in the ambulance, and transported to the county morgue that was located inside Marquette General Hospital. Deputy Cusino already knew that the 12-person Ontonagon Sheriff's Department, which did not include crime scene techs, would have to get help from the state to investigate Judy's death. And that call for assistance went out to State Police Sergeant Detective Bill Ball at about 6:40 p.m., a little over 5 hours after Judy had left her parents' home to go walk the dogs. After getting the message that a woman had been found dead out and back of Cherry Lane in Ontonagon, 67 miles to the south, the 21-year veteran investigator immediately hopped into his cruiser. And an hour and a quarter later, Detective Ball was standing in the Ontonagon Sheriff's Department, listening intently to Deputy Casino summarize what law enforcement had found and done so far. Detective Ball had a well-earned reputation for not making assumptions about the cases he worked on, and for being tenacious about gathering the facts he felt he needed before reaching any conclusions. So, after going to view Judy's body in the morgue, the investigator did not immediately agree with the deputy medical examiner's suggestion that, like most shootings in the Upper Peninsula during deer hunting season, this death was accidental. And even if it turned out to be accidental, Detective Ball intended to find out how it had happened and whose bullet had actually killed Judy. So, even though it was now pitch dark, Detective Ball, along with 8 other members of local law enforcement, including the sheriff and Deputy Casino, headed back into the woods behind the Blake house where Judy's body had been found. And this time, using higher-powered flashlights, the searchers found something that the deputy's earlier search had missed. About 37 feet west of where Judy's body had been found, the sheriff was standing under a maple tree and pointing upwards with his flashlight at a fresh horizontal scar in the tree bark. Looking at that mark, both the sheriff and the detective knew they had just gotten their first potential break in the case. Because if that slash on the tree had been made by the bullet that killed Judy, then maybe they could figure out the bullet's trajectory and find the bullet as well as a spent shell casing that would help them identify what kind of weapon killed Judy. Detective Ball decided to order tracking dogs out at the scene for 9 a.m. the next morning, but in the meantime, at about 10:30 p.m., the detective decided it was time to talk with the grieving family. Deputy Casino, who had informed the Blakes and Judy's husband at about 5 p.m. that Judy had been killed, now joined the detective, and a few minutes later, the two men were walking out of the woods towards the Blakes' home on Cherry Lane. Looking up at the lighted windows of the house in front of him, Detective Ball was already especially interested in one particular person, Judy's husband, Bruce. Because in every case involving the death of a wife or husband, the first suspect is always the spouse. A few minutes later, the investigators were seated at the Blakes' kitchen table. Judy's mother, Mary Ann, had been given a sedative to control her hysteria, so the investigators conducted their initial interview with only 3 family members. Judy's father, Dale, her brother, David, who lived with his family in Ontonagon, and with Bruce. According to Deputy Casino, Bruce had been dumbfounded by the news of his wife's death, and one of his first questions to the deputy had been to ask if his wife had been wearing a blaze orange when she was found in the woods. After being told no, Bruce had leaned his forehead against the hospital wall and gently pounded his fists into its hard surface. Looking now at the stunned faces staring back at him from across the table, Detective Ball kept his questions short and to the point. He was just here to collect first impressions, find out when Judy was last seen, and to find out where each of these people he was speaking to were earlier that afternoon. By the time he left the house a half hour later, Detective Ball knew one thing for sure. Every person at that table appeared to have a solid alibi for the 4.5-hour window between the time Judy left the house to walk the dogs and the time when her body was discovered. On Tuesday, December 1st, one day after the end of Michigan's deer hunting season and 2 days after Judy's death, one of Michigan's biggest newspapers ran a story with the headline, "Deer Season Gets Safer." In that article, which attributed 4 deaths and 25 injuries to hunting accidents in the 1992 season that had just come to an end, Judy's death was listed as a possible 5th accidental fatality, but one that was currently being investigated by local and state law enforcement. Ontonagon Sheriff was quoted in the paper as appealing to anyone with information to please come forward. And one day later, on Wednesday, December 2nd, the day of Judy's funeral service in Ontonagon, Detective Ball received a phone call from the police department in Marquette, where Judy lived and worked. An officer there was passing along information from an anonymous caller, information that made Detective Ball decide it was time to head for Marquette to take a closer look into Judy's work life as well as her personal life. In the meantime, local officers were able to pinpoint the likely time of Judy's death to about 2 p.m. That's the time that several residents in the area had each heard a single gunshot coming from the woods behind Cherry Lane on November 29th. Detective Ball also had officers check out other leads, possible criminals who had recently been released from police custody, reports of unidentified or strange people in the area where Judy was found, and reports of anyone in that area who was seen carrying firearms. In addition, assuming now that Judy had been killed at around 2 p.m., Detective Ball ordered officers to double-check every alibi provided to them by Judy's husband, father, brothers, and cousins, along with the alibis of any other family member who was not actually inside of the Blake household when Judy was shot. But it was Detective Ball's decision to call in an Ontonagon civilian to assist in the investigation that would eventually give police their first real breakthrough. Armed with his metal detector, 42-year-old Dan Castle had earned a reputation among Ontonagon law enforcement for being able to recover hard-to-find evidence lost in the Upper Peninsula's dense forests. Now, on Thursday, December 3rd, Dan Castle was standing with Detective Ball and Deputy Casino at the exact place behind Cherry Lane where Judy's body had been discovered. A chemical wash applied to the blaze mark on the maple tree 37 feet away had revealed the presence of lead, a metal that is commonly found in bullets. Now, the man with a passion for finding buried treasure had the difficult, if not impossible, assignment of finding the bullet that had passed through Judy's body and then ricocheted off of that tree 5 days earlier. And while Dan was looking for that bullet, Detective Ball headed for Marquette County, where the Moylanens lived and worked. If Judy's death had not been an accident, the detective needed to find out who might have wanted her dead and why. It didn't take long for the state police investigator to realize that the anonymous caller had been right. Judy's life and Judy's past were much more complicated than Bruce and her family had led them to believe. Judy's co-workers and supervisors at the Marquette General Hospital would soon tell detectives why it had taken almost 2 weeks for the Moylanens to replace the station wagon Bruce had totaled on the first day of hunting season. According to the rumor mill, Judy was facing some serious financial issues, and just scraping together $500 for a down payment on the 5-year-old replacement van had been a big challenge. It would also turn out that Judy had recently contacted several of her creditors to ask about restructuring her loans, and when the bank turned down her application to refinance the couple's mortgage, Judy had mentioned to one of her coworkers that she and Bruce might be facing bankruptcy. But aside from learning about the Moylanens' financial problems, when it came to suspects in what could either be an accident or murder, the investigation seemed to be hitting one dead end after another. None of the reports of other hunters or suspicious people in or near the place where Judy died had turned up any viable leads. As for Judy's husband and other family members, police had not been able to find any hard evidence that would link any of them to Judy's death. Not only had Judy's husband, Bruce, prepared a list of people who could verify his whereabouts on November 29th, he had also willingly signed off on a consent to search form. That form gave police permission to examine and inventory Bruce's collection of firearms, as well as examine Judy's various life insurance policies, the payout from which could have provided a motive for Bruce to kill his wife. It would not be until mid-December that the state police investigator would get a series of tips that, together, would break the case wide open. The first of those tips came from Dan Castle up in Ontonagon. For 9 frustrating days, all Dan had found in the woods behind Cherry Lane were bottle caps and old coins. But on Sunday, December 13th, exactly 2 weeks after Judy was shot, Dan decided that before giving up the search for the bullet, he would try a simple physics experiment to pinpoint exactly where the bullet might have come to Earth. So, trading his metal detector for a slingshot and a pocket full of marbles, Dan stood in the exact location where Judy's body had been found and stooped to what he guessed would have been a point level with Judy's chest, where the bullet likely entered her body. Once in this position, Dan fired marble after marble at the blaze mark on the maple tree, and each time the marble ricocheted off the blaze, he made a careful note of where the marble landed. Once he had a cluster of marbles all in the same general area, Dan pocketed his slingshot and again took up his metal detector. And sure enough, in that area where the marbles had clustered, just 77 feet away from the maple tree and buried under a 2-inch layer of snow, Dan discovered a fresh bullet lying on top of the dead leaves that blanketed the ground. Dan grabbed his radio, and an hour later, Detective Ball was standing in the woods with Dan, both of them looking down at this critical new piece of evidence. And when the Marquette State Police Crime Lab ballistics expert arrived for work the next morning, Detective Ball was there waiting, sealed evidence bag in hand. And before the day was out, Detective Ball had 2 more important pieces of information. Crime tech experts had confirmed the .30 caliber bullet that Dan had recovered had in fact killed Judy. Embedded inside the bullet were not only traces of wood from the maple tree, but also fibers from the jacket and shirt that Judy had been wearing the day she was shot. The analysis also showed that Judy's death was no accident. According to the ballistics expert, the bullet was still rising as it passed through Judy's body before ricocheting off the maple tree, which meant it had been fired not from some great distance away, but at close range, and by someone who had put the sights of their guns squarely on Judy's chest. And by the end of that day, the lab had also provided Detective Ball with a list of guns that could have fired a .30 caliber bullet and left distinctive markings that matched the ones they found on this particular bullet. On the same day that Dan Castle had discovered the bullet that killed Judy, Detective Ball received a final tip from a hospital administrator at Portage Hospital in Hancock, Michigan, about 2 hours north of Marquette General Hospital, where Judy also had a job in hospital administration. 36-year-old Gail Lampinen wanted to talk with police about a person who she claimed had been stalking her and who also might have a connection to Judy's death. 2 weeks later, Detective Ball would hear a similar story about the same stalker from another hospital employee, Judy's good childhood friend, Leanne Wysocki, who was employed as a nurse at Marquette General Hospital. But it wasn't until Gail opened a box of sweaters that the stalker had given her as a gift that the police were able to connect all this information together to finally uncover the identity of the person who killed Judy Moylannon. And what they discovered would become one of the most sensational crime stories to ever come out of Michigan's remote and mysterious Upper Peninsula. Based on Detective Ball's investigation into the information provided by these two women, here is a recreation of what happened to Judy Moylannon on the last day of her life, Sunday afternoon, November 29th, 1992. After spending the morning inside the house helping her mother prepare the traditional Sunday after Thanksgiving lunch of turkey casserole and then washing up the dishes afterward, Judy was glad for the chance to get outside and take all 5 dogs for a walk in the woods that she loved. Even though Streak was not as well trained as the Moylannon's dogs, Judy figured he would stay with the pack as they walked. And if he didn't, Judy knew there was only one place Streak would go, and that was home to her parents' house. As Judy let her dogs out of their kennels behind the house, she pulled her black down coat a little tighter around her. Even after the scare she and Bruce had had when they were out hunting on Friday at Dishnot Creek, when that bullet from behind them had come so close to where Judy stood near her hunting blind, Judy still hadn't bothered to put on a blaze orange safety vest for this walk with the dogs. Unlike Dishnot Creek, the woods she now stepped into were too close to the houses on Cherry Lane to attract any hunters. And so, as Judy and the dogs stepped into the woods, the bright pink of her shirt collar was quickly swallowed up among the trees. But to Judy's killer, it wouldn't have mattered if the 35-year-old mother was wearing an entire outfit of blaze orange, because the murderer was not hiding in the woods that afternoon to hunt. The murderer, who was maybe just 50 yards from the path Judy was most likely to follow, was there to kill. And at this distance, hitting Judy was going to be an easy shot. And when it was all over, the murderer was confident that it would look like just another tragic deer hunting accident. Stray bullets had been known to travel so far in these woods that the hunters who fired them would have no idea that they might have struck a human and not a deer. And besides, Judy already appeared to be a very accident-prone person. She had a 5-inch long scar on her head from a concussion that happened a year earlier, and after that, there had been a fire in the Moylannon house that could have done some serious damage if the smell of smoke hadn't caused Judy to wake up and put the fire out. And whatever the risks, once this was done, once the killer had gotten rid of Judy, the killer would then be able to concentrate on 2 other women, Gail Lampinen and Leanne Wysocki. The first time Judy passed by the killer's hideout, the killer only raised their rifle and aimed, placing the sights on Judy's chest, but not pulling the trigger. This trail led to a field where the dogs could run, and then Judy would pass this way again on her way back to her parents' house. Better to wait, so anyone back at the house wouldn't connect the sound of a shot to Judy just having left for her walk. Sure enough, a few minutes after 2 p.m., the killer could hear Judy and the dogs once again approaching the killer's hiding place. This time, when the killer leveled their sights on the side of Judy's chest, they pulled the trigger. The gunshot seemed to echo like a bolt of thunder through the quiet woods, and one of the dogs immediately broke from the pack and ran in the direction of the Blake house on Cherry Lane. Even as the killer ran through the woods to the nearby empty lot where they had parked their vehicle, the killer knew they'd been lucky. Instead of giving chase, the other 4 dogs just stayed right where they were. As the medical examiner's report would later show, the single bullet that killed Judy entered her body just under her right armpit before exiting through her left rear shoulder, ricocheting off the maple tree 37 feet away and landing in the sodden leaves where Dan Castle would discover it 14 days later. On its way through the soft tissues of Judy's chest cavity, the bullet basically tore off the top of Judy's heart. After the bullet had struck and killed Judy, she fell on her side at a right angle to the trail, her head on a slight rise and her feet in a pool of icy water. All 4 of her dogs would stay close to her body for another 2 hours. That's when Judy's mother would also walk into the woods looking for Judy and blow the dog whistle that finally called the dogs home. There was nothing Judy's killer could do to retrieve the bullet they had fired, but the killer had made sure to collect the spent shell casing before leaving the woods. Later, the killer would use a torch to destroy the gun and shell casing before disposing of the weapon in the nearby Ford River. On December 13th, 14 days after Judy's murder, Gail Lampinen decided to open the 5 boxes that had been left on her doorstep the day before. Happily married, Gail had already confided to her husband about the unwanted attention she had been receiving at work, and now apparently at home. But looking down at the pile of cardboard boxes at her feet, Gail was forced to admit that unwanted attention was an understatement. This looked more like the behavior of a full-blown stalker. Taking the first box into her bedroom, Gail opened it and looked inside. Neatly folded and packed, she saw a collection of women's sweaters in various styles and colors, but as Gail took each sweater out of the box, she realized they were not new sweaters. And a moment later, she pulled out a piece of yellow-lined notepaper. It was a letter addressed to her, dated 6 months earlier, and it was signed by Judy Moylanen, a woman, as Gail well knew, who was now dead. Gail had hardly finished reading the note before her hand was on the telephone, and a few minutes later she was connected to Detective Ball's office, where she left a detailed message for the investigator. The letter may have been signed by Judy Moylanen, but there was no doubt in Gail's mind who the real author was. It was the same man who had left those boxes, the same man who had been sending her suggestive cards and notes, stopping by her office and showing up unannounced at the Lampinen house. It was, in fact, the same man who had been bragging to her just a few days ago that before long he'd be quitting his job as a technician at Marquette General Hospital thanks to a financial windfall that was about to make him a very wealthy man. And when Detective Ball returned to his office and called Gail back, he could practically hear the last few pieces of the puzzle fall into place. It would take months to prove their case, but Detective Ball and his team of investigators now had the bullet, the gun, the motive, and the evidence they needed to bring Bruce Moylanen, Judy's husband and killer, to justice. It would turn out the Moylanens' financial problems could all be traced to Bruce's poor money management, bad business decisions, and potentially fraudulent activity involving his insurance company, North County Claim Service. But Judy had only recently become aware of just how bad their money situation was. It was only when the couple's application to refinance their home was turned down that Judy had called the bank and realized that because of Bruce's money mismanagement, the family was facing possible bankruptcy and legal action. And, as Judy confided to a close friend, over the following weeks, Judy was learning more and more things about Bruce that made her scared and unhappy. Meanwhile, when Judy confronted Bruce about their precarious financial situation, Bruce became convinced that Judy would divorce him and take half of all of his assets. To Bruce, a much better option was to kill his wife and make it look like an accident. And while Bruce had insisted to police that the payout on Judy's insurance policies could hardly amount to more than $40,000, when police had searched Bruce's house in mid-December, they realized he was lying. While no single insurance policy on Judy was worth a fortune, Bruce had made sure he had taken out multiple policies on his wife. Hidden in an attic crawl space in the Moylanen house, Detective Ball had found a whole packet of those policies. And in the event of an accidental death, when the payout doubled, like a deer hunting fatality, when you added all the policies together, Bruce stood to walk away from Judy's death with a total of more than $300,000, an amount that would be worth $637,000 in 2022. The Moylanens' paperwork also revealed that in addition to a financial motive for wanting Judy dead, Bruce did in fact own a rifle that could have fired the fatal bullet that Dan Castle recovered. Listed as one of Bruce's assets on a loan application was a Remington 300 Savage, one of the weapons that the state crime lab said could have caused the distinctive riflings on the bullet that killed Judy. As for Bruce's alibi, he lied about that too. And once police interviewed every person on Bruce's list, they realized Bruce could not account for where he was between 1:45 and 2:45 on the afternoon that Judy was killed. But even though recent financial problems may have pushed Bruce and Judy to the breaking point, serious problems in the marriage had shown up at least 2 years earlier. That's when Bruce met Gail Lampinen at Portage Hospital when he was making a delivery there. Known throughout the hospitals in the area as an aggressive and awkward flirt, Bruce seemed to have fallen especially hard for Gail, even though she and her husband did their best to discourage Bruce from visiting and calling Gail. And once Judy was dead, Bruce launched an all-out romantic assault on Gail, one so obvious it prompted that first anonymous tip to police in Marquette, in which the caller reported that Bruce was stalking a hospital employee. As for the letter Gail had found, enclosed with the boxes of sweaters Bruce had dropped off at the Lampinen house, Bruce, writing as Judy, told Gail that the couple had grown apart and would soon be getting a divorce, and that Bruce would need Gail's help in finding a new partner, a woman exactly like Gail herself. But even without the handwriting analysis that confirmed Bruce was the author of the so-called sweater letter, it was the postscript at the end of the note that convinced Gail that Bruce had written the letter as a way of speaking directly to her. Quote, P.S. Don't tell the prospects, but believe it or not, Bruce is incredible in the sack. Not that Gail was the only target of Bruce's unwanted advances. The day after Judy's funeral, Bruce also started hitting on Judy's best childhood friend, Leanne Wysocki, a nurse at Marquette General Hospital, even going so far as to suggest that she might want to move in with him and 3-year-old Elise. And as Leanne reported to Detective Ball in late December, Bruce had told Leanne details about the shooting that had not been made public and that only Judy's killer would know, like exactly how the bullet had entered Judy's body just when her arm was swinging back, and how it was the perfect timing of that shot that resulted in the massive internal injuries that killed his wife. It would also turn out that Bruce may have made 2 earlier attempts on Judy's life. Back in 1991, so a year before Judy was killed, he apparently pushed an 85-pound chimney block off the roof of their house onto Judy's head. If the block had not glanced off of her head, Judy likely would have died rather than sustaining a severe concussion that put her in the hospital for 3 days with no memory of what had happened to her and a 5-inch gash on her scalp. A few months after that, Judy woke up one morning and found the house full of smoke. It would turn out that before leaving to go hunting, while Judy and Elise were still both asleep, Bruce had dropped live embers from the wood stove onto a pile of dry firewood in the basement. But despite the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence against him, it wasn't until Bruce failed a lie detector test and police showed him a copy of the sweater letter that he had written to Gail that Judy's husband finally confessed to killing his wife. On April 23, 1993, 5 months after Judy's death, Bruce told investigators, and later Judy's own brother David, that Bruce just couldn't take it anymore and suddenly went nuts. He told Detective Ball that in addition to threatening him with divorce, Judy had been a tyrant whose long workdays forced Bruce to do more than his fair share of the cooking and childcare. As for the timing of Judy's murder, Bruce said that it was just a lucky guess that Judy would go out that afternoon to walk the dogs. He said that the first time Judy had passed him on the path in the woods, that he just couldn't bring himself to shoot her. And then on her return trip, he said he aimed the rifle once and then lowered it and then raised it one more time, closed his eyes, and pulled the trigger. On December 15, 1993, Bruce Moylanen was convicted of premeditated first-degree murder. He would later be sentenced to life in prison without parole. The only time Bruce showed any emotion during his trial was when Gail Lampinen took the stand to testify against him, at which point Bruce began to sob uncontrollably. Judy's brother, David Blake, and his wife, Yvonne, adopted and raised the Moylanens' little girl, Elise. Judy's mother, Marianne Blake, died at the age of 71 on November 29, 2007, exactly 15 years to the day that her only daughter was murdered. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to house sit for the Amazon Music follow button, but when you get there, just prop all their doors and windows open and leave. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast features 2 stories that will make you think twice before leaving the trail. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Dinner, and it's about a solo hiker who makes a big mistake. And the second and final story you'll hear is called Rattlesnake Canyon, and it's about 2 people who find themselves in a totally hopeless situation. As the story unfolds, ask yourself, if you were in their position, what would you do? But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, after the Amazon Music follow button has gone to bed for the night, secretly sneak into their room and slightly unplug their phone charger from their phone so it looks like it's plugged in, but it's not charging. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called Dinner. In the summer of 2015, a young man named Paul was on his last day of a 7-day solo backpacking trip through a very remote area in Utah called the Dark Canyon Wilderness. Dark Canyon gets its name from its steep walls that block light in the morning and in the late afternoon. It's an area that's only accessible by foot, and it's not uncommon to go in there and not see another person the whole time you're there. That morning, Paul got up and set off on a day hike that would take him through a very forested area up onto a plateau where he planned to camp out for the night. About a mile into the hike, he found some amazing elk antlers and he decided he wanted to keep them. So he threw them on his backpack and rested them at the top and continued on his hike. But the added 15 pounds of weight proved to be far more exhausting than he was anticipating, and very quickly he blew through all of his water. Even though he was within 1 mile of his final destination, this plateau, he decided to stop because he was so dehydrated, he needed to find water. So he puts his pack down, he puts the elk antlers down, and he starts walking around, and amazingly, he does find some water. Granted, it was kind of a gross puddle of standing water, but he figured, I can boil this, and it should be okay. And as he's preparing a fire to boil this standing water, he figures, you know what, if I'm making a fire here, I might as well just make my camp here. So he sets up his tent and then he makes a fire and he's about to start boiling this water when he realizes how dumb he's being. If there's a puddle of standing water right here, then probably just a little ways upstream there's going to be some running water. Why don't I not boil this crappy water that will only yield, a couple sips of water and go look for the running water where I can drink as much as I want? So he puts the pot down and he leaves all of his gear at the campsite and he begins walking up this mountain to hopefully find a stream. And after about a half mile of walking up this mountain, he finds this little spring. Immediately, he's down on hands and knees drinking as much water as he possibly can because he's super dehydrated. And after he's drank for quite a while, he reaches down to his belt where he kept his water bottles. And he realized he left all of his gear, including his water bottles, at camp. So he didn't have a way to collect this water. And so he's like, shoot, I gotta go back to camp and get the bottle and come back. I'm gonna burn a bunch of energy. But he's like, you know what can you do? I need the water. And so he gets up and he turns around and he starts walking back towards his camp. And immediately he starts to feel really anxious as he's walking back. He can't help but feel like someone's behind him watching him. And he kept turning his head thinking he's going to see someone just over the mountain who's quietly stalking him. And he just could not shake this feeling. And so as he's walking back to camp, every little sound he hears is totally throwing him off. Every little rustling leaf, every little bird overhead, he's totally on edge because he's convinced someone is behind me or someone's over there, someone's watching me. He finally gets back to camp, he gets his water bottles, and he considered not going back to the spring because he didn't want to cover that distance again because of how stressful it just was. But ultimately, he knows he needs the water. So either he's going to sit here for a really long time and boil a bunch of stagnant water, or he can just suck it up, walk to the spring, get some water, come back, and be good. Before he walks up to the spring, he grabs a really big stick to use as a club, and then he walks up. So now he's got some protection. And immediately, as he begins that half-mile trek to the spring, the anxiety pours right back over him, and he can't help but feel like someone is watching him. But he gets up to the spring, he fills his water bottles, he turns around, and he starts walking back, and he walks down this little rock face and lands on the trail he had just been on a minute ago, and he stops because he sees something on the ground that wasn't there before. A fresh mountain lion print is placed right in between two of his footprints that he had just made on his way back to the spring. Meaning, there's a mountain lion somewhere right around here that's not just watching me, it's hunting me. Paul doesn't really know what to do, so he runs to his campsite and gets in his tent and huddles in his tent for the rest of the night, hoping a mountain lion doesn't attack him. And fortunately, it does not. And what he thinks probably happened was when he picked up those elk antlers and put them on his backpack and was walking around with them, he probably attracted the mountain lion that thought he was an elk and therefore food.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Rattlesnake Canyon.
At about 1:30 in the afternoon on August 8, 1999, a park ranger named Lance Madsen stood frowning down at a dusty red Mazda car inside of an otherwise empty parking lot just outside of Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico. Lance knew the two men who owned this red Mazda had taken out a one-night permit to be allowed to go into Rattlesnake Canyon, which is one of the most isolated parts of this national park. It's basically just a single long, scrubby little trail that's kind of all desert with high canyon walls on either side. In order to get access to Rattlesnake Canyon, people need to go to the visitor center and literally fill out paperwork so the park rangers know they're out there and can go out and check on them if they don't come back in time. And so the two men who owned the Mazda had done that. They had filled out all the paperwork, but now Lance was noticing they had not returned at the end of their permit. They had stayed out, presumably in Rattlesnake Canyon, for an additional 3 nights. Now, Lance was not concerned because people did do this. It was more like he was annoyed because now he would have to go out into Rattlesnake Canyon and find these two guys and figure out what was going on. So Lance and the park volunteer that he was with began walking on the trail in the direction of Rattlesnake Canyon. And after walking less than a mile on this trail, Lance and this volunteer looked up ahead, and just off the trail, there was a green and maroon tent that was pitched right out in the open. And so Lance immediately assumed that this had to be the two men who owned the red Mazda. And so very quickly, Lance's annoyance was replaced with relief because it turned out it was really easy to find these two campers, and he'd be able to go figure out what was going on and either get them back to their car and get them to leave, or if they wanted to, they could, in theory, extend and stay longer with the right permitting. But when Lance and his partner walked down the trail and left the trail to go walk over to this tent, they started to notice there was something off about it. Right away, as they got closer and closer to this tent, they began to smell this horrible kind of chemical burning smell. And then also all over the ground were all these little bits of burned pieces of trash. And then finally, when Lance and his partner actually arrived right in front of the tent and they were looking down at the closed flap, it was zipped shut, they saw clearly there was something moving around inside of the tent. But whoever or whatever it was wasn't making any noise. And so Lance and his partner, they kind of looked at each other, and they both at this point were pretty nervous. You know, their hearts are racing. They don't know what's going on here. And then Lance just kind of impulsively reached down, unzipped the tent, and lifted it open. And when he saw what was inside, he immediately was hit with this wave of fear and anxiety. Three days earlier, on August 5th, 1999, a 26-year-old man named David Coughlin woke up in a sleeping bag inside of his green and maroon tent in Rattlesnake Canyon. And as soon as David sat up, he smiled because he could hear right outside of his tent the sound of his best friend, Raffi Kodakian, making breakfast and gathering up supplies for that morning's hike. Dave and Raffi were on what they called a trip of a lifetime. 6 days earlier, they had left their hometown of Boston, Massachusetts, and traveled more than 2,000 miles west, sleeping at campsites and cheap motels along the way. Their final destination was a university in Santa Barbara, California, where Dave was going to be getting his master's in environmental engineering, but they were going to basically turn the journey out to California into a big vacation. And Carlsbad Caverns National Park was easily both of the men's favorite spot so far, because unlike the other campgrounds they had stayed at so far, which were kind of cheap and small, Carlsbad Caverns was huge. It was 47,000 acres of just wild desert. And so for Dave and Raffi, whose normal everyday lives were kind of safe and boring, doing desk jobs and the like, this felt sort of thrilling, like they were cowboys exploring the Wild West. As Dave sat inside of his tent, listening to Raffi make breakfast and get ready, Dave noticed he was already sweating, despite it being pretty early in the morning. It was just already so hot outside. And so Dave grabbed his water and took a sip, and as he did, he thought about that park ranger who had helped them fill out their paperwork to be allowed to come out into Rattlesnake Canyon, who had made a really big deal about ensuring that Dave and Raffi each have at least 1 gallon of water per person per day that they were going to be out here because of the heat. But after they had left the park ranger, Raffi, who had way more experience camping than Dave did, explained to Dave that that was totally overkill and they didn't need that much water. So instead of bringing 2 huge gallons of water for the single night they planned to be out in Rattlesnake Canyon, Raffi had brought along for both of them just 3 16-ounce bottles of water. For reference, that's approximately 6 times less than what the park ranger had suggested. The men had already used one of those 16-ounce bottles of water to boil hot dogs the night before for their dinner, and now the bottle that Dave was drinking from was already half empty, and so he was pretty much down to the last of his water. But Dave wasn't really worried about his water because he and Raffi were going to be hiking out of Rattlesnake Canyon that day and heading back to their car and continuing their journey out to California. And they knew they had set up their tent very close to the parking lot. And so it was a short hike. They're back in their car and then they're good. And so Dave capped his water, he got out of his sleeping bag, he left the tent, and he joined Raffi in prepping their supplies to get ready for their hike out. And by 8:30 a.m., their entire site was packed up and the 2 men were on their way heading back. The 2 men walked at a leisurely pace in the direction towards their vehicle for about an hour, and as they walked, they did see signs that they were on the right trail. There were these stacks of white rocks that marked the trail, but after walking this full hour, they knew they probably should have been at the parking lot, but they didn't see it yet. However, the 2 men were not worried yet because remember, they know they're close, and so they're thinking, okay, maybe a couple more minutes and we'll see the parking lot. And so they stopped, they had some more water, and then they kept on walking. But after walking for another 2-3 hours still in the direction that they believe was towards the parking lot, they did not see the parking lot. In fact, they didn't see anything that looked familiar, and there were no more stacks of white rocks to show they were even on a trail. They were totally lost. And so Dave and Raffi, who were doing their best not to panic, they both sat down, they pulled off their packs, and they pulled out their topographical map and began looking for some sign of where they were. But neither man could read the topographical map, and so all the swirls on the map showing every contour of every geographical feature, it just didn't make any sense to them, and so the map was of no use, and it was getting hotter and hotter by the minute, and so Dave and Raffi put the map away feeling totally frustrated, and for a second they thought about getting up and just continuing to walk roughly in the direction they thought they should go, but as soon as they stood up, they both just felt so exhausted from walking and the heat, which was now, it's noon, so it's really burning down on them. And so the 2 men just walked over to the edge of a canyon wall where some shrubs were kind of hanging off the wall, providing a little bit of shade. And the 2 men just plunked down right underneath the shade, and they just sat there in silence. Both men knew they did not have the supplies to stay out in this canyon for much longer. They certainly didn't have enough water, which now really was starting to feel like a huge oversight. But luckily, as they're just sitting there, these huge storm clouds rolled in, and for a very short amount of time, there was this incredible downpour of rain. And so Dave and Raffi begin catching the raindrops in their mouths, and they begin drinking the water off of rocks and leaves. And I mean, it wasn't a lot, but it was enough to kind of boost their spirits. They got a little bit more hydration in, and they were kind of ready to deal with the problem they were facing. After the storm had gone, Dave and Raffi decided that their best move was just to continue walking and try to find this parking lot. But despite this motivation, Dave and Raffi would walk for hours and hours into the night. They would not find the parking lot, and so finally they realized they would have to stop and set up camp for another night. And so Dave and Raffi, who by now were really starting to feel scared, they found this washed out gully and they set up their green and maroon tent, but neither man could sleep. And so they just sat outside of their tent, telling each other that don't worry, the park rangers are bound to have noticed that we did not come back in time. We only had that 1-day permit. We've exceeded the limit. They're bound to come out here and find us. But in the back of both Dave and Raffi's mind, they weren't so sure that was definitely going to happen. They didn't really know how long it would take for park rangers to notice when people stayed too long. But as Dave and Raffi were speaking, they suddenly noticed far off in the distance something that looked like headlights, like on a car. And it was moving across the horizon. And both Dave and Raffi thought, wait a minute, that's got to be a road right there. All we have to do is go to that road and we're saved. We don't need the park rangers to come rescue us. And so suddenly Dave and Raffi were filled with hope, and they forgot about how thirsty and hungry they were, and they just crawled into their beds and they fell asleep almost immediately because all they wanted to do was get to the next morning where there'd be daylight so they could hike out and get to that road and get back home. Dave and Raffi woke up early the next morning, and they were very eager to get up and start making their way towards this road. But instead of packing up their campsite and bringing it with them, they decided instead to leave their campsite and leave behind a journal that had some information about who they were and what they were doing in case park rangers came looking for them. And so Dave pulled out a journal from his pack and he drew a kind of crude map of where this campsite was and where they were going towards this road that appeared to be up on this ridge. And then also Dave included in this note, Dave and Raffi's names, their ages, where they lived, some contact info, and also the fact that they were completely out of food and water, and that if you find this journal, please follow up and make sure we're okay. And so after leaving behind this journal at the campsite, Dave and Raffi set off to go to this road. But after walking for hours and hours up a kind of gradual incline, they reached what appeared to be this kind of third ridge where up and above the ridge was this road. But to get up onto this kind of wall right in front of them was really challenging. There was cactus everywhere, and the gullies that kind of led up to the top of this ridge were very slippery and almost vertical, so nearly impossible to climb. And so this was really a chore getting up there. And you got to remember that Dave and Raffi are already totally exhausted. They have no food, no water, and so this is miserable. But eventually Dave and Raffi were able to get up onto this ridge, and they looked out and there was no road. There was nothing. It was just pure desert as far as they could see. And so they had no idea what those lights were that they saw. Clearly it was not headlights. I mean, for all they knew, it could have been a figment of their imagination. They're desperate to be saved, and so maybe it was possible that they imagined seeing this road. And so as the two men stared in stunned silence at nothingness in front of them, they noticed that a buzzard had actually begun flying in slow circles over their head, almost like it was just waiting for the two men to die so the buzzard could come down and eat them. Now, Dave was ready right then and there to head back to their campsite and just wait, but Raffi was insistent that they just keep on going because you never know, maybe there is a road just a little bit farther along. But after walking for maybe a couple more hours, they did not see a road, and by this point both men were beyond exhausted, and so the two men did finally turn around and painstakingly walk their way all the way back to their campsite. And as they're walking, they're telling themselves, maybe we'll get there and park rangers will be waiting for us, a search party will be here. But when they got to their campsite, there was absolutely no sign that anybody had come to their campsite since they left. Their journal with their note and their crude map and all that was still just sitting right in the middle of their campsite, untouched. And it was at this point that Dave and Raffi's spirits were just totally broken. The next morning was Saturday, August 7th. So Dave and Raffi were now beginning their 4th day in the desert and their 3rd day without any water. Raffi had gotten really sick from drinking his own urine, and Dave had begun to experience all these horrible stomach cramps, very likely from eating unripe prickly pears. Also, Dave's legs were starting to seize up, which made it nearly impossible to walk. And so the two men knew they had no chance of hiking out of here to safety. They really just had to wait for their rescue to come. And so that day, Dave and Raffi attempted, with the little energy they had, to make a huge SOS symbol on the ground using rocks. But after putting the S down and the O down, they didn't have enough energy to collect more rocks to make the last S. And so they did not finish their SOS symbol. And then also Raffi at some point soaked his sleeping bag in fuel and lit it on fire to try to create a smoke signal that somebody might see. But the smoke didn't get high enough, and so it didn't work. And so all that really accomplished was it destroyed Raffi's sleeping bag and also created this terrible stench around their campsite of burning chemicals from having burned the polyester material that made up the sleeping bag. And so by that afternoon, when the sun was right over their head and beating down on them, Dave and Raffi just crawled inside of their tent and laid there in silence. And as they did, they noticed the stones underneath their tent felt kind of cool, and so they cut the bottom of the tent out and just laid directly on these loose rocks inside of their tent. By that evening, when still no rescuers had arrived, Dave and Raffi really began to realize that this could be the end. And so Dave, he grabbed that notebook where they had drawn that crude map of where the lights and the road had been, and he flipped the page, and then he wrote a note to his girlfriend, basically saying goodbye, because he knew he was probably going to die. And then Raffi, he took the journal, and he did something similar, but also included that, he would not allow the buzzards to get them, that they would at least ensure their bodies were intact for their families to find. And then after writing these notes and tucking the journal away, Dave and Raffi crawled out of the tent because by now it's dark out, the sun's not out, it's a little bit cooler outside. And the two men, they sat down and they began having a fairly matter-of-fact conversation about the situation they were in. Both men were very emotional. At one point, Dave began screaming and crying just out of despair. But at the end of this conversation, the two men made a decision, an unthinkable one, that really would only ever be made in a situation like this. And so after both men were on the same page, they crawled inside the tent and zipped it up. It was the next morning, August 8th, 1999, when that park ranger and his volunteer that was with him had walked along the trail towards Rattlesnake Canyon and discovered Dave and Raffi's ransacked campsite. And they had walked up and they had seen all the burned materials nearby, which was Raffi's sleeping bag and other bits of trash they had tried to burn. And then they had gone to the front of the tent and Lance had opened it up. And when he looked inside, he saw Raffi, who was alive. He was laying on his side and he was only wearing these filthy green shorts. And he just looked totally emaciated and terrible and haggard. I mean, the guy really looked like he was on death's door. Then Raffi, when he saw Lance looking in, he just said, "Please tell me you have some water." And Lance did have some water. He gave it to him. And then Lance, knowing that Raffi was with another person, Dave, he said, "Hey, where is the guy you were with?" And Raffi, as he's drinking the water, just kind of casually pointed out of the tent somewhere off behind where Lance and his partner was. And so Lance and his partner, they turned around and they didn't see anybody. They were just kind of looking off towards the canyon wall and there was nothing there. And so Lance turned around again and he said, "Are you sure he's over there?" And Raffi, without any expression on his face, just continued to point and said, "Yes, he's right over there." And so Lance, he got up, he turned around, and he began walking towards this canyon wall. But before he got there, he nearly tripped over this arrangement of rocks on the ground. And when he looked down at them, he knew someone clearly had arranged these rocks in a particular way. And so, with a growing sense of dread, Lance reached down and he moved aside one of these rocks. And underneath it, he saw Dave's face. It would turn out, the night before, when Raffi and Dave had crawled outside of their tent and began having that very intense conversation, what they were talking about is, what do we do? We know we're going to die. No one's going to reach us before we die of starvation, or we die of dehydration, or maybe some animal is going to come attack us and kill us. Like, we don't have any hope. And so as they were sitting there, Dave actually pulled out his pocket knife and attempted to cut his wrists, but he couldn't cut deep enough to actually kill himself. And so Dave said to Raffi, "You're going to have to kill me. And then after that, you're going to have to kill yourself." And Raffi had agreed. And So Raffi and Dave, they went back inside their tent with no floor. It's just open rocks on the bottom. And Dave, he lied down on his back and he pulled his shirt up and he exposed his rib cage. And then Raffi, he pulled out his 4-inch pocket knife and he placed it right up against Dave's rib cage. And then with Dave basically egging him on to stab him, Raffi attempted to push the knife into his heart, but he couldn't break the skin. And so Dave, he's now screaming out in pain, but he's still urging Raffi to come on, just do it already. And finally, Raffi does manage to get the knife right through his ribs and into Dave's heart. Dave did not die right away, but Raffi covered his mouth and continued to push that knife in until he did die. And then once Dave was dead, Raffi used the little bit of energy he had to drag his body away from the tent where he buried him under those rocks. And then Raffi, who now has no energy left, just crawled back to his tent and laid down on those loose rocks inside of his tent and waited to die. But just a few hours later, on the morning of August 8th, Lance the park ranger, along with his volunteer, had come down and discovered Raffi before he had died. Little did Dave and Raffi know, this campsite where they had been for the past few days was just a 15 or 20-minute walk from their car. 9 months later, on May 11th, 2000, Raffi pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. However, Raffi insisted throughout the trial that the reason he killed Dave was because Dave asked him to. It effectively was a mercy killing, and that Raffi intended afterwards to die himself. This was murder-suicide. And Dave's family believed Raffi, and so did another judge. And so ultimately, Raffi would only serve 16 months in prison before he would be released.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Every now and again, I'll find a story that's just really upsetting to me. Now, obviously, a lot of the stories I cover are all quite distressing, but today's story, which is about a missing hiker named Mike Turner, it just really upset me. It actually made it really hard to record this episode. So consider this your warning that I personally believe this is a very upsetting story, but an important story that we would not be covering if there wasn't some real weight behind it. And I think the moral of this story ultimately is you really need to treasure your family while they're still around. And you'll see what I mean when you hear the rest of this story. It's heartbreaking. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, on the hottest day of the year, offer to give the Amazon Music follow button a ride to work. And when they get in your car, blast the heat on full and refuse to stop. Even though it hurts you, it hurts them too. Okay, let's get into today's story.
On the afternoon of August 2nd, 1998, a 48-year-old, 6-foot, 6-inch tall hiker named Mike Turner stopped for a moment and took his bottle out of his backpack and took a sip. Mike was standing in a cluster of trees on the side of this mountain about 11,000 feet up, inside of an area in Wyoming called the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. The Fitzpatrick Wilderness is easily one of the most visually striking places in the entire world. It's like all of the extremes of nature kind of collided together in this one place. You have these massive, 13,000 foot tall snow-covered mountain peaks, you have glaciers, And then right below them, right at the base of these huge mountains, are all these lush green fields full of tall grass and flowers and animals running around and little streams and lakes. I mean, it's absolutely picturesque. In fact, some of the pictures of this area, they look fake. They're so ridiculous. But the real reason the Fitzpatrick Wilderness was known as this unbelievably beautiful place was because really it went kind of untouched by people because it was so hard to get to. I mean, basically the only people who stepped foot in this very surreal landscape were really experienced outdoors people like Mike Turner, because it took a lot of know-how just to get to this area and to survive in this area. This is a very, very rugged place. But Mike Turner was not content just going to the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. He really wanted to experience the true nature of this area. And so what he was doing while he was out there was hiking off trail. And so he's in this totally remote place, hiking around in an area that was not even marked on a map. Now, to anybody who has not done any compass and map navigating out in the wild, this might seem totally reckless. And to a degree, it sort of is. But it's something that people totally have a knack for. I can speak from my own experience. When I was in the military, we did a lot of compass and map navigating, like in the backcountry in Alaska and also in California. And I was terrible at it, but I can tell you some of my classmates definitely had sort of like an innate skill to understand where they were in relationship to terrain features. And then if you combine that with proper training and experience, I mean, these guys got really good at just being able to navigate with a map and compass. And so Mike was one of those people that really was an excellent navigator. And so walking off trail like this in such a remote place was sort of routine for him. Now, Mike was not some full-time adventurer. This was something he did that was sort of a passion for him. His job was he was a reverend at a Christian church in Idaho, and he had been for 10 years. And Mike loved being a reverend. He loved his congregation and, his wife, Diane, and his 3 kids. He had 2 daughters and a son. They were all super involved in the church. I mean, it was a great thing. But at the same time, being a reverend was a lot of work, a lot of responsibility, and a lot of stress. And a way that Mike had found to kind of cope with that growing stress of being a reverend was to go out hiking. He actually found, sort of ironically, that when he was out in nature hiking, he felt closer to God than when he was inside of his church preaching. And it was because he sort of looked at the world as this grand gift from God, and imagined being in the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, looking at this unbelievable terrain. I mean, it looks like, God made this. I mean, who else could? This is so strikingly beautiful. And so with that as context, on this particular day that Mike had stopped to sip water 11,000 feet up on this mountainside, this was actually the 4th day of a 9-day pre-planned solo hike through this wilderness that Mike had been planning out for over a year. Now, even though Mike was a very skilled hiker and backpacker and survivalist, he knew doing any sort of really long solo hike came with a whole bunch of risks that only really come if you're solo hiking. The biggest risk being that if you get into trouble when you're out on a solo hike, well, you're all alone, so you better have a really good plan for what you're going to do if you get into trouble. And so Mike had come up with a great plan. He had spent that whole year mapping out this off-trail path he was going to take over these 9 days. It was a 60-mile trip through the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, and he drew out basically exactly where he expected to go on a map, and he gave that map with all the different coordinates and exactly where he'd be on each day to his wife, who also was a very enthusiastic hiker, and he told her, on the 9th day, you're going to meet me at this spot at the end of the 60 miles at noon on this 9th day right here, and I will meet you there and you can take me home. However, that plan had changed on that 4th day as Mike was sipping his water on the mountainside. And only Mike knew it because he had no way to communicate back to his friends and family. Cell phones were very primitive at the time, so he couldn't just call somebody. I mean, basically, if he deviated his plan, he was the only one who would know. Now, the reason why Mike, on the 4th day of this 9-day trip, decided to alter his course made a lot of sense. So even though Mike was technically solo hiking, he was not actually alone. With him was the family dog named Andy, who was a very good-natured black lab mix who loved going hiking. And over the course of the previous day and then into this 4th day, he and Andy had been up at elevation at about 13,000 feet, walking on some icy parts of the mountain, and Andy's paws were getting really raw from kind of walking on the jagged ice. And that day, on the fourth day, Mike had noticed Andy was whimpering and struggling to keep up when normally Andy was super energetic and running all around. And he knew that, my course that I'm supposed to be going on for the next few days is going to be going all through these mountains with all this ice. And I don't think Andy can keep up. He's not going to be able to do it. And so he had decided to side skirt the mountains to avoid the ice. And even though this path was definitely going to take him a little bit longer, it would still bring him to the same destination, to that same pickup spot where his wife and his family would be waiting for him. Now, Mike understood that by deviating his route, not only would his family not know, like they would have no idea where he was, but also this secondary route he'd be taking to save Andy's paws was going to take a little bit longer than the intended course would take. And so he knew he was not going to be there at the time he said he would. So he was not going to be there at noon on the 9th day. It was going to be maybe the 10th day or beyond. But Mike had planned for this contingency. He had brought extra supplies specifically if he had to extend his journey. And so he felt confident that even though this was a big risk, to take this path that nobody knows he's on, he felt he could do it with no problems. And so after Mike finished taking a sip of his water, he pulled a bowl from his pack that was for Andy, and he poured some water in it, and he placed it on the ground, and Andy kind of made his way over and began lapping at the water. And as he did, Mike looked down and saw Andy's tail wagging happily, and Mike felt confident, seeing how much better his dog was already doing, that this was definitely the right decision. Taking this secondary route was definitely the way to go. But as Mike waited for his dog to finish drinking, Andy suddenly stopped and then lifted his head up with his ears perked up like he had sensed something. And then before Mike could stop him, Andy just took off running into the trees and disappeared. Now, Andy was a playful dog that periodically kind of ran around on the hikes like this. But remember, Mike is out in the backcountry and he's deviated his path. He needs to be really sure of where he is. He can't afford to make mistakes here. And if Andy just goes rogue and he has to go chase after him, the opportunity to get turned around or lost, or maybe come in contact with some big predator that maybe Andy has sensed, were pretty high. And so Mike grabbed the bowl and took off running into the trees after Andy. And after going into those trees, he emerged on the other side, Mike did, and suddenly he was hit with this incredible view, kind of looking down towards this lake. And there was this huge clearing on this side of the mountain that was filled with these huge boulders, like boulders the size of small cars. And they were everywhere. Basically, the mountain, as it eroded, chunks of rock were rolling down into this clearing that was sort of at a slant down towards this lake. And it just filled the entire clearing with boulders, to the point where you really couldn't actually walk on solid ground. The only way to get from where Mike was and where Andy was, because at this point he could see his dog was making his way towards the lake. Clearly, that's what Andy had sensed, the lake, and he was going to get a drink or something. And so Mike knew to get to his dog, he would basically have to climb onto the boulders and jump from rock to rock all the way to his dog. And so Mike tried calling for Andy one more time to stop and come back, but Andy was on his own program going towards the lake. And so, resigned to the situation, Mike climbed on top of the first boulder and began jumping boulder to boulder in the direction of his dog. One week later, on the afternoon of August 9th, Mike's wife, Diane, along with her 3 kids and some family friends, stood at the start of a trail called the Big Sandy Trail, which was the designated meeting spot where Mike said he would meet his family at the end of this 9-day journey. And as Diane stood there at this meeting place, she kept anxiously checking her watch. Mike was late, and not just a few minutes late, he was a full 24 hours late. Mike was supposed to be there on the 8th at noon, and now it's the 9th, and he's still not here. But remember, Mike is a guy that did stuff like this fairly regularly. He was very competent out in the wild, and everybody knew when he went off on this journey that of course there was some variability to when he would actually arrive at the meeting place. Despite Mike saying, I'll be there on the 8th at noon, Diane and her friends and family all sort of felt like, well, I hope he's there at noon, but realistically he might be, several hours or maybe even a day late, and that's okay. And so the day before, when he didn't show up at noon, people were anxious, but they were okay. Now, 24 hours later, and still Mike has not shown up, there's no trace of him, Diane and her kids and the family friends, they were starting to worry. And in fact, before Mike left on this trip, he told Diane that if for some reason he does not show up on the 9th, so 24 hours after he said he would be there, And it's past 4 o'clock on the 9th, this is the trigger point, that Diane should call the authorities and assume something is wrong and send out a search party. And so Diane is checking her watch on the 9th, and soon enough, it's 4 p.m., Mike's not here, 4:05, 4:10, 4:15, still no Mike. And even though she knew her husband said, now it's time, go get the authorities, she just couldn't bring herself to do it. She felt like it's such a huge to-do if you get a search party organized out here. I mean, that's a massive effort, super expensive. And she felt like the second she told authorities that like Mike would come walking out of the wilderness with a big story to tell and a big apology for being late. And so she convinced herself that, you know what, give him one more day, I'm sure he's bound to show up. But the next day, on the 10th, when still there was no sign of Mike, that morning, Diane did go to the authorities and she reported Mike missing. And just as she expected, a massive search was launched for Mike. But you need to keep in mind here that again, Diane and the searchers and everybody besides Mike has no idea that he has altered the path he was on. And they're going to be searching this massive expanse of wilderness that even with the best of conditions, knowing exactly where someone is on their route, I mean, it's so hard to find people out here. I mean, it's totally rugged. Things are obscured from view, from the air, from the land. There are areas you can't even get to. There's predators out there. I mean, this is a dangerous thing to be doing. And again, they don't know he's not even on that path anymore. He's deviated. And so, despite helicopters in the air, horseback teams out in force, hundreds of volunteers combing the area looking for Mike, nobody found a trace of him. And after 2 weeks went by with this huge search producing nothing, they finally had to call it off. And so, of course, Mike's family is just unbelievably devastated. They have no idea what's happened to Mike. But 5 days later, so 5 days after the end of the official search, we're now at August 28th at this point, a couple of backpackers were hiking through an area in the Fitzpatrick Wilderness that was actually about 17 miles away from the last known sighting of Mike Turner. Now, that was not when he went through the trees and saw the boulders. This was around the time Mike literally began the 9-day epic journey. Somebody had seen him in one area, and so where these two backpackers are is about 17 miles away from there. And so these two backpackers, they were aware that Mike Turner was missing because there were flyers up all over the place around the outside of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness at the beginning of all the trailheads and in town and all over the place. So they were aware of this, aware that Mike was missing and his dog was missing. And as they're just sitting there taking a break, this totally emaciated, ragged-looking black lab came out of the tree line, whimpering and looking like it was on its last legs. It was Andy. And right away, these backpackers knew that's the missing dog. And so they lured the dog to them with granola bars, and Andy came up and he ate, they gave him water. And just so you know, Andy would survive and make a full recovery. And so after these backpackers have Andy in their possession, they immediately contacted authorities, who then got in touch with Mike's family and said, hey, we found Andy. And so you can imagine the absolute roller coaster of emotion Mike Turner's family is going through. Now that they hear Andy is okay, Andy's come out of the forest, they're thinking, oh my goodness, maybe Mike is okay too. Maybe Andy can lead us back to where Mike is. Mike is this totally skilled survivalist. He's got to be alive out there. And so after discovering Andy, a second search was launched using Andy as the guide dog. They basically went to that spot where the backpackers found him, and basically Andy's family and some other volunteers allowed Andy to lead them back into the wilderness, hoping it would lead them to Mike. And so as this new search began with Andy leading the way, a separate backpacker, who we will call Brian, just for the sake of the story, that's not his name, but we're going to call him Brian, he was hiking through a section of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, not near where Andy was. This is a separate area. And Brian, he was not involved in looking for Mike Turner, but he was aware that Mike was missing because, again, he had seen all the missing person flyers, he'd seen the news, and when he began his own hike into the wilderness, he had seen at the start of his own trailhead a big flyer with a picture of Mike Turner and his dog saying he was missing. So Brian's aware of Mike Turner's absence, but he's just going on his own hike into the wilderness. And after a few days of solo hiking his way into this totally rugged expanse, he eventually reaches this kind of dense cluster of trees about 11,000 feet up on the side of a mountain, and he walks through those trees, and when he emerges on the other side, out in front of him, sloping down to a lake, is this unbelievable boulder field that practically takes his breath away. But that was not the thing that really got his attention. Instead, as he's taking in these boulders and this unbelievable view of the mountains in the distance and this lake, he noticed there was a man sitting on a rock fairly far across this boulder field with his back to Brian, just staring at the lake. Now, remember, this is like the middle of nowhere, and Brian certainly was not expecting to come across any other person on this journey. And so naturally he thought, okay, I need to go up and make sure this guy is okay, or if nothing else, I want to talk to him. I mean, this is a very rare thing to come in contact with other people out here. And so Brian began walking towards this guy to see what was going on. Well, that man was the missing hiker, Mike Turner. My goodness, did Mike Turner have a story to tell. But to understand Mike's story, we need to go back 29 days to the point when Andy the dog had taken off running from Mike and he had gone into the boulder field, and Mike had emerged through those trees and seen the boulders, he's seen his dog, and he began climbing onto that first rock to begin making his way towards his dog. So Mike, he gets up on that rock, and he begins hopping from boulder to boulder to boulder. And at first it's going fine. He gets about halfway across the boulder field. He's, yelling to Andy to stay put, and he's kind of making his way. It's all good. But then he reaches this one particularly large boulder that when he jumped onto it, it was kind of unstable and it began to wobble under his feet. And so instinctively, Mike tried to leap off of the wobbly boulder onto another boulder that was right nearby. But when he jumped, he sort of undershot this second boulder and so did not land on it and stay put on it. Instead, he kind of hit the face of this second boulder and slipped down to the ground. Didn't hurt Mike, he's just now on the ground in this small space between the boulders. However, unfortunately, the wobbly boulder right behind Mike, well, it didn't just continue to wobble, it wobbled to the point where it rolled forward and literally came to a rest against the second boulder that Mike had just jumped onto and failed to land on top of. Basically, wobbly boulder impacted second boulder, sandwiching Mike between them. But critically, it did not harm Mike. This is going to take some explaining, but it'll make sense after I go through it. Wobbly boulder had what looked like almost a U-shaped cutout on the face of the wobbly boulder. Like imagine a perfectly round boulder, but there's like a divot kind of sitting on the front of it. And it just so happened that on the second boulder in front of wobbly boulder, it also had a sort of divot on the face of it, kind of looking like a U-shape. And when these two boulders collided, these 800-pound boulders, Mike happened to be standing exactly in the position where those two cutouts wrapped around him like shackles. They basically pinned his ankles together, where he could not pull his legs up and out of this totally tight space that was just big enough to hold his legs in place. It was like he was anchored to the ground. But again, Mike is unharmed. His legs aren't broken, he's not battered, nothing. He just cannot move. Now, Mike instantly would have known this is a really big issue because he can't move these 800-pound boulders. They are 800 pounds, and he's by himself minus his dog, who can't really help him with the boulders. And so Mike immediately just jumps into, oh my goodness, I have to find a way to somehow just move these boulders even just a millimeter, a centimeter would be enough to free his feet. And so he pulled off his bag, and one by one, he pulled out every piece of equipment he had, including his camera tripod and his stove and whatever he had. And he did everything he could to try to pry these stupid boulders off of him, but they would not budge. And so after 2 hours of trying in vain to free himself, it dawned on Michael that he was not going to be able to free himself. The only way he was getting out of here is if somebody found him and rescued him. And so Mike, doing his best to stay calm, he pulled out his journal he had brought along for this trip in order to detail, his closeness with God and, what he was learning throughout this journey. And he began documenting what happened to him to include, why he was in this boulder field, what he was doing when he got stuck, how he wound up in these sort of granite shackles, so to speak. He also very clearly in his writing was very much putting his faith in God to get him out of here. He wrote in his journal on this first day, 2 hours into this predicament, I am in your hands, Lord. I don't know what I may face. The idea being, I don't know what's going to happen to me, but my faith is in you. I know you will help me through this. And so after writing this initial entry, Mike turned his attention to survival. Like not trying to push the boulders off, but trying to survive amidst the boulders as long as possible. And so he pulled out his blue sleeping bag and kind of wrapped it around himself to insulate himself. He got out his stove, and there was some snow in reach, and he began putting snow in his stove and melting it to create water. And he also pulled his tent flap over the top of him. I mean, he was basically setting up camp inside of these boulders. And that first night must have been absolutely horrifying. I mean, the temperatures dropped down to near freezing, even though during the day it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But that night, he's in this horrible position, just trapped with his own thoughts, just hoping and praying that, God was going to get him out of here. The next day, when Mike woke up, he wrote in his journal some more, and he began detailing his biggest fears. One of them was potentially having to have his legs amputated if he got out of here. The damage of losing circulation to his legs was scary. He wrote that he had food for at least a week, but he only had 2 quarts of water, and there wasn't all that much snow around him left to melt, and he was running out of fuel, and so he was really worried about not having enough water, even though, very ironically, he was like 25, 30 feet away from a lake, which he could have drank water from, but again, he's trapped to the ground. And so on the second day, Mike actually attempted to throw his water bottle, which he connected some rope to try to get it into the lake, to capture some water and pull it back to him. But when he threw it, it was just short of the water. He could not get it into the water, so he couldn't scoop any water into his bottle. And then when he tried to retrieve the bottle, as the bottle was being dragged towards him, it got wedged in some rocks. And again, he can't move, so he can't possibly fling it out of these rocks. And so he couldn't even get his water bottle back. And so by the end of that second day, Mike's tone in his journal began to change. It wasn't totally negative yet, but he began talking about how, man, I wonder what's going to happen when I run out of water. I wonder what my urine will taste like if I mix it with Crystal Light. So it was kind of like he was joking about the fact that he was going to try to make his pee taste better, but it also showed he was beginning to realize just how serious the situation was. Nobody knows where he is. He's completely off the beaten path. He has no idea if anybody even knows he's in trouble, and he's about to be out of water. The next day, so the third day of being trapped inside of these boulders, Mike would once again begin writing in his journal. And his tone seemed a bit more optimistic, despite the fact that he has not solved, this water crisis he's about to face. He's down to his literal last quart of water. But in his journal, he talked about how this whole trip he went on, this 9-day trip he had planned out, the whole point was to become closer to God. And he felt like, I've really done that in the past couple of days. What I wanted to achieve, having a really spiritual event here, it's happened like times 100 being trapped here. I mean, this is the closest I've ever felt to God. But you could just tell there was just an underlying sense that I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to learn from this experience. I'm not going to take stupid risks anymore. I'm going to be a better father, be a better husband, be a better reverend. I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to improve as a result of this suffering I'm going through right now. However, over the next few days that Mike continued to be trapped in these rocks with no help coming, his optimism clearly waned. He began to write that he was angry with God. He wondered, is this a punishment for something I've done? And he also thought, maybe I failed God, and that's why I'm here. But it was just clear that Mike, who was this deeply spiritual person who absolutely believed in a higher power, how could he be in this terrible position and not be getting any sort of help from God? How could that be? But unfortunately for Mike, his situation only got worse. On about day 5 or 6, as Mike was laying wretchedly inside of this horrible camp he had built, he noticed that he had completely lost feeling in his left leg. Like completely. It was a dead leg at this point. And even though he knew by this point how bad of a situation he was in, this sparked a new, very real fear inside of Mike that he detailed in his journal. He knew his body was actually beginning to break down, and still there is no help, no divine help coming in despite all his prayers. There's no one coming to rescue him. He is all alone. In fact, Mike would write in his journal something that practically brought me to tears when I read it first, and it just said, "So lonely, more than I imagined." I just can't picture what it would be like to be trapped out there. You're not hurt, but you can't go anywhere, and you're all alone, just slowly withering away. And your family, they're somewhere out there, they have no idea, nobody knows. It's just unbelievably devastating. The mental torture this man went through is just out of this world. but it just keeps getting worse. Day 6, day 7, Mike at some point actually dropped his journal, and because he can't actually reach it anymore, he just picked up whatever objects he had and continued writing on them, like his pocket Bible, and then also there was an instruction manual for his stove, and he would write in the margins, and his writing just continued to get more and more pessimistic and sad. He began writing about how intensely he regretted his decision to take the long route. He was totally setting him up for this situation. Nobody would have known where he is. And so he's hating on himself. He's still mad at God. Why aren't you here? Aren't you seeing how badly I'm suffering? I mean, this is a guy who's basically losing his mind with regret and anguish and just pure loneliness. I mean, this is horrible. Then on the 7th and 8th day or 9th day that he was stuck in these boulders, once again, Mike's writing on his random things that he wrote on took another turn. Not only was his writing becoming more and more illegible, because he's literally dying here. I mean, his body's breaking down. He's exposed to the sun all day, and then at night it's freezing cold. He's not having any water. He's drinking his urine. He's got no food left. He can barely write. His writing begins to talk about his family and his children. At this point, Mike must have known the end is near. And so all he had was just the thoughts of his family. He began wondering, what his kid's life were going to be like in the future, because obviously the implication here is he knows he won't be there to see it. He'll be dead. And then in some of the last entries he would make, it was obvious that really Mike had turned back to God. Now he was back to approaching God with open arms. He was no longer upset or questioning God's plan. He was just ready. He actually wrote in his journal, "Fill me with peace, Lord. May my conditions not deny my love for you." And then he wrote, "I'm ready to die, though I'm missing my family." And then in his final entry, which must have been on the 10th day of his predicament, Mike's writing was basically completely illegible at this point because he's right on death's door. And even though you can't really tell what he wrote, at the end of this final entry, it says, "Love, Dad." It was like he was saying his final goodbye to his family. Then Mike took off his wedding band and he placed it on the rock next to him because he knew once he died and decomposed, the ring would fall off his bones and be lost in the rocks below. And he clearly wanted his family to have that wedding ring, so he placed it on the rock and then he prepared to die. When Brian the hiker walked up to the sitting man he saw on this boulder, he realized almost immediately that that was Mike Turner because he had seen the missing person flyers before he came into the wilderness. And so knowing this is the guy they're looking for and knowing he couldn't move him, covered him up, and then he took Mike Turner's wallet, which contained his ID, and then as fast as he could, Brian the hiker made his way back to the beginning of the trailhead and contacted authorities. I will say it took Brian almost 3 days to contact authorities, and he was going as fast as he could, retracing his steps. So that really gives you a sense of really just how remote of an area Mike was in when he passed away. And then also it would turn out that Andy the dog, who was leading that secondary search, he wouldn't find Mike before Brian would. But once they discovered where Mike had died and they checked the direction Andy was taking his family, it was obvious that Andy was heading in that direction. He was a faithful dog going back to save his owner. He just wasn't going to get there in time. And to close the story out, making it even more tragic, on the day that Mike left his wife Diane and his 3 beautiful children to begin this 9-day trek, after he left, Diane received a bouquet of flowers in the mail that Mike had sent that he knew would arrive after he had left. And attached to this bouquet was a note. And the note was written to Diane, and it just said, "Thank you for letting me live this adventure. Know that wherever I am and whatever I'm doing, I'm thinking of you."
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.